I don't know, it was always like, I couldn't bear not to be able to read a book in Korean, just because it seemed like the natural next step. I can't, the idea of living in a society and not being able to read its books is not acceptable to me on any level. And it just, again, this comes back to when you meet expats who don't do it, I'm not saying they're bad, they're not bad expats, but why don't you want to? It's like with, this is another sort of hobby horse of mine, and Brian Myers, is about North Korea analysts who don't speak Korean. I get that you can do it, but why are you not interested enough in Korea as a culture? Why do you not have the interest enough to do it? Why isn't it natural to do it? Like, why would you not do it? Or here, it's, the expats who feel marooned, I guess they don't feel an obligation, or never did. But so I keep coming back to this one question: is which civilization are you choosing? Right? Are you choosing to inhabit this civilization, or are you not?
One of the places, Colin, I want to start with this conversation with you is because, now this might sound strange to some people, but you probably speak better Korean than some of the Korean guests I've had on this show. And this is not to say, but these would be people that are perhaps in America, or they might be Korean American.
This is Kyopo standards. I'm playing by the asterisk against my name.
And I knew you would immediately be humble about your Korean language, but for those that don't know, and it's not perhaps well advertised, but you've hosted podcasts in Korea, in Korean, like full on.
Yes, yeah, and as a proof of concept to see to myself, can I do this? And I've done a few over the past 5 or 6 years just to see, like, let's try it. What if I put this up? Knowing that I'll put it up made me think a little harder. It focuses your mind, and it gives me a chance to talk to Koreans I would want to meet anyway, or writers I knew, and I'll do it more this year. I've just done a few scattered over the years, just as I say, proof of concept, can I do this? And when I hear the ones I did a year ago, or 2 years ago, or 5 years ago, I think what I want to think, which is, oh, I sucked. Because that means I must be better. Because, whether it's speaking or writing, you always want to look back on your own work, even from last week, ideally, and say, oh, that sucks. I could do so much better now, with the height of my powers thus far. But yeah, the podcast is Colin Hanguk. And I admire your industry on this podcast. You're giving me an example of sort of what it is to work on a podcast. So I may put some fraction of what I see from you, what I see you doing, into that this year, just to get it going regularly, not just to be for a thing for myself, but something people could actually follow, which means you have to do it regularly, right? That's the most important thing, regularity, in which I used to podcast in English, which is why I first visited Korea, in fact, in 2014. And my podcasting in Korea, the interviews I recorded here shaped my worldview, in a sense, shaped for me what it was to live in Korea as I would soon do as a Westerner. Most of my guests were Westerners, although some were Koreans, like Son Hyun-woo from Talk to Me in Korean.
What a good dude.
What a good dude. He's always ready to podcast.
Yes.
But Michael Breen, whose book The Koreans, that was the only one of those two he'd written at that time I'd read. The first interviewee, in fact, I had here was Brian Myers, the North Korea analyst in Busan. Yeah. And I'd interviewed him before on the phone for other things, so I kind of knew him. But my view of Korea as a Westerner, now having been here 7 years living, is still to an extent Brian's. The things he said, and I asked him not about North Korea, but about South, because he never talks about living in South Korea, or at that point did not. So I was like, I want to hear, what is it to live here in South Korea? Not just as a North Korea analyst or a vegan, both of which make life difficult for him, but what is it like to live here? Because I had no idea. And he gave me, the interview is very popular. Still, I hear from people I meet, or I get emails. Even he does. Like that interview, people love it. He says, people really tap into it somehow. And Brian is a hugely articulate guy.
Yes.
In English, but also in German and in Korean. And we're talking about Korean skills. I think I've never spoken to him in Korean, but I think he would probably give me a run for my money.
I've spoken to him in Korean.
Okay, so
via emails and correspondence, but yes, he is.
I see. He's solid. And in other Japanese and Chinese, his Chinese is decent as far as I understand. And I study these languages too, but he's got a big jump on me when he started. He was living in Korea in the 80s, right? Things like that. So he missed out. He saw times in Korea I missed out on, and so did you, because you've been here 10 years longer than I have. Is that right? 2015? No, 2005. I got here.
Yeah.
2015.
What were some of the things that Brian Myers told you? What did you glean? What did you learn? Was there sort of one takeaway? Because
Yeah, it's funny because like many expats, Brian was sounding pretty negative in this conversation about Korea. And eventually I asked him, well, what do you like about South Korea? What do you like about living here?
Yeah.
It's not the food. Certainly, it's not having to go to Gimbap Jeongguk and ask to take out all the animal products.
it's not the political left.
It's not the political left, or right for that matter. But he said, he's good at illustrating points with anecdotes. He says, there's a flexibility here. A Korean friend was driving me around, and we drove up to a parking lot, and it's the sign said Manwon. He's like, she drives into the lot, and I'm pretty sure that lot is full. She's like, there'll be a space. Sure enough, there was a space. Or he says, another car example. In Korea, you'll see someone park across, a couple of disabled spaces right in front of the Pyeongjom, and nobody will cause a fuss about that. This could be a bad thing as well, but it's like you'd have a road rage incident, possibly a deadly one, on your hands in the U.S. if you did that.
Yeah.
He likes how you don't have the sense of ambient violence in South Korea, this is a comparison to the U.S., but it's funny because Koreans say, oh, no, we're violent. We get in fights. You go out late enough at the potsa, the table's going to go over, the cops are going to get called. But he's a fellow American, and he appreciates how you don't feel like you're about to get into it's not like you always feel like you're going to fight, but this is maybe true in London as well. You feel like a conflict could erupt around you at any moment, and you've got to be at least defensively prepared to handle that. Yes? If you're in Trafalgar Square at midnight, waiting for a bus.
There's places that are a bit naughty, mate.
It's not even that, but something could go wrong.
Yeah.
Here, if something goes wrong, people can deal with it. Like there are cultural systems in place where a problem gets handled. Whereas in the U.S., you're never sure. Like things could go very wrong if they go wrong.
Yeah.
Right.
And I've said that so many times. One of the reasons why I do live here, why I like living here, raising my children here, is that I find it safe. I find it clean. I find it that I don't fear about walking down certain places. Now, I know there might be other people in society that don't feel that same safety.
Yeah, they're called Koreans. They would say, safe? Clean?
Yeah.
You're in Seoul. This is the worst city in the world. It's filthy. And they say things that we can understand. Like, what do you mean the subway is good? This is a car city. People drive. Like, you have to drive in Seoul. No one would ever say that from the U.S. or from the U.K. They'd say, I came here so I don't have to drive. But the Korean vision of Seoul and of Korean society is, I don't know what it is. If the negativity is a load-bearing element, or if I used to live in Los Angeles, and I still am obsessed with Los Angeles and still write about it. And there's a phenomenon there where people in Los Angeles, because it's a city, in a way it's an immigrant city, even domestically, people come to Los Angeles, and people get stuck psychologically in the Los Angeles they arrived in. They'll still see, and if they got there in 1983, they're still today seeing the Los Angeles of 1983, even if it's directly contradicted by what's in front of their eyes. And here in Korea, it's like a Korean will say, I can't stand, I just went to Tokyo, everybody was quiet on the subway. You come back to Korea, and everybody's just barking into their cell phones. They're not doing that.
No.
Maybe on line one, but not the other ones.
No, I would agree with you.
And it's like, why? Do you have a sense of why this is? Why are they still seeing the Korea of sort of the 1990s at the latest for many of them? Even if they didn't experience that.
It's that Latin and Malia back in my day when I was that. and the music that we listened to when we were 15 still, resonates. And there's this idea
still
that...
Sonolim.
Absolutely.
I do like, this is not a knock on Sonolim by any means.
No. Really amazing band. I think they really influenced what they were putting out, like with Udip in Egypt in the mid to late 70s, I think is really great. I think it sounds like Gang of Four, Red Hot Chili Peppers. It's some really interesting stuff, I think.
And vitally had that distance so they could not directly imitate. They couldn't replicate Western music.
It wasn't replicating. I see the replication going the other way. I think there might have been some Western artists that heard that and went, nobody's going to know about that. Let's get some of that. Yeah, yes. Absolutely. I think there would be that. There's this... I want to hit on that flexibility thing first, and then because I think that's so interesting about South Korea. This is going to sound like a name drop, but it's a genuine true story. I was going to see the New Zealand ambassador, Mr. Philip Turner, for a coffee. Yes. And I turned up to this place and I tried to park, and the guy was like, no, you can't park here. And I was like, but I've got to go and meet this guy in 10 minutes. And he was like, no, you can't park here. So I looked at him and I went, can I give you some cash? And he went, yeah, absolutely. And he just
Absolutely.
immediately changed. He was like, yeah, absolutely. And it's going to cost you, I think he said, 5,000 won.
Yeah,
Just not
basically
even much,
nothing,
right? But
yeah.
it just took that flexibility. And
It took that flexibility.
you need that confidence to push things. You need to be able to do it in Korean, but it is a society where...
It rewards aggressiveness in a way. I mean, with learning Korean, I've been working on this book. I'm under contract to write a book in Korean, which is one reason why I haven't done much podcasting, is because it takes, as you know, a long time just to get started on the day's writing in Korean. I don't want to do it. Like your brain is like, I don't want to do this.
No.
I don't want to start writing a thing in Korean. When you get into it, it's fine. But just the ramp up. And I was working on an essay about learning Korean. Like, is Korean a hard language or not? Or to what extent is it hard? It's not that academic. But I was saying in that essay, you really do have to be aggressive in practicing it. Because you meet, and I meet, we both met Westerners who say, I want to learn Korean. Whether that is true or not, who can say, I want to learn it, but everybody speaks English to me, so I can't learn it.
Yes.
And if I reflect on my 7 years here, not that long, not long compared to you, or compared to, a Mark Peterson, an episode I enjoyed, got here in 65, against which we are both Johnny's come lately. Again, drawing from my experience, I've been addressed in English maybe 10 times in 7 years. It just doesn't happen that much. So I think people who say that, if it's true, Westerners who say, I can't practice because I go to the IDEA or wherever, and they say they take my order in English, they weren't being aggressive enough. They weren't, coming up. I always start the conversation. That's the thing. I don't wait to be addressed. And on the rare occasions I do get addressed in English, I speak in Korean or just leave. And more often these days, the latter. I'm getting a little more ornery the longer I'm here, which is a Korean-like trait, perhaps. But you do have to, if you push people, I guess they respect it, or they go with it. Like, okay, this guy's not gonna go with English, so I'd better just go back to Korean. This works, right? This is true.
And you might you say something perfectly in Korean the first time, they'll look at you and they'll go, huh? As if they weren't even expecting it. I find that quite a lot, that I'll say something and I think it's just like this, I'm not sure, cognitive dissonance that might be going on in their mind. They're not sure, did you really just say that in Korean?
Where is this happening to you?
I find it with Gyeongbya Joshis quite a lot. Security guards and things like that. And maybe age plays a role in that. They're genuinely
maybe
old.
It does. I've been living in Sinchon the past 7 years. You're here, and I'm about to move from Sinchon, so I'm reflecting on what makes Sinchon. One thing is, there's so many students now, foreign students who go to the universities all around there, Yondae, Ide, Seogang, who can speak enough Korean that the level is, the bar is set, right? They think, people around the coffee shop owners, whomever, they see a foreigner, they think, oh, well, they probably speak some Korean.
Yep.
Maybe that's a Sinchon thing. And I'm moving to Gachisan, so we'll see if that's a Gachisan thing.
There's definitely, I would suggest, in terms of language, I want to ask you about the book in a minute and the actual aspect of learning Korean, but there's definitely this element in which international students coming to Korea, because I see them a lot in my university lectures, they've got excellent Korean skills now. Not all of them, but I will encounter that the overall level has increased. You've got some excellent speakers. You've got people who are nearly fluent. Of course, you have the ones that really haven't got to get grips with the language yet. But overall, I think that's definitely increased. And so at the same time has the English ability of my Korean students. I mean, 10 years ago and now it's night and day. Your book, you've just dropped a bombshell that you're contracted to write a book in Korean.
I am.
Rather than talk about my aspirations, what can you give us any idea of this book? And do you have a book in English?
There's one in Los Angeles I'm working on in English, but I face no real pressure to complete it while I'm here, so I work on it, but then I feel like it's just growing and growing. I have an agent in English too, and I think she'd appreciate. I've been talking to an agent about it, and she'd appreciate if I got a section to her that she could then market. But that's another story.
Your first book might be a book in Korean, is what I'm asking.
Probably
you.
will, given the pali nature of things here. But it happened because it's funny. I envisioned this happening, but I envisioned it happening because I occasionally do write in Korean, and so I was thinking, let's publish more in Korean and then get that track going as well.
Yeah.
But it was not Korean writing that caught the attention of a publisher here. It was actually something in English I wrote. It was a piece on the 10th anniversary of Gangnam Style in The New Yorker. And an editor in Korea contacted me. He's like, you need to be writing something in Korean because this is not a perspective we get
Right.
from Koreans or foreigners. And he was saying later we met up, if I can interpret what he was saying in English, it would be, you're not looking down on Korea and you're not raising it up either. And he said it was rare to his mind to find that. So I kept that in mind, like this is the sensibility I'll need to plow forward with when I write in Korean. And instinctively, I don't want to. I never have moments, and this surprises a lot of foreigners. One of the rare times, I assure you, I was in Haebangchon. I was talking to some foreigners standing around smoking, and some English bankers, I think, were there, and other randoms. And I was saying, I've never had a single moment here in Korea, in, again, only 7 years, where I've thought, I hate this country. I hate these people. I just can't do this. And these guys, your countrymen, as I say, no, they didn't believe it. Like, what do you mean? That's me every day. I say, I hate this country. I hate these people. So I don't have the instinct to point out what I don't like about Korea. There are things I don't like. But at the same time, it's not interesting to read. Write what you want to read, right? And at the same time, the sort of, Korea is so wonderful. I love this about Korea. I love that about Korea. Love of a place is, to my mind, not an interesting emotion to write from. I'm very interested in Los Angeles, as I say, to the point of obsession.
Yeah.
Would I say I love it? I don't know. I mean, what is love of a place? And I've talked with foreign friends here, like Western writer friends, who also bristle when we go back to where we came from to visit, and someone will say, "Oh, you love Korea." Like, we didn't say we love Korea. It's someone telling us, "Oh, you love Korea. You love Seoul." Right? Well, where are you getting that from? I mean, yes, I live there. And I guess there's the calculus like, this American lives in Korea. He must love it, because if he didn't love it, why would he leave America? Which is a fair point in a way, because not a lot of Americans leave. The English have more of an instinct to go abroad for long periods, yes? Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, absolutely. Not necessarily always to South Korea. That wouldn't be the stereotypical. You might find Provence or Spain or something like that, Benidorm. But it's very easy to be a grief merchant about Korea. It's very easy to hate on Korea and find immense popularity for your work. I find that's a huge avenue of what a lot of writing about Korea is. You focus on all these horrible, terrible stories, and people will, I worry, because people will be on the outside of Korea and they'll see this through social media and they'll think that, basically everyone's going around depressed, not having children, killing each other, and it's this kind of dystopia.
When they're not cramming for the Suneung.
When they're not cramming for the
one
Suneung.
test that determines the life of every South Korean. It's the same 5 stories over and over again. Korea as dystopia. I don't read news coverage of Korea in English for that reason. It's just, there's nothing there for me. But it's not for me. It's not written for me.
No, it's not. And but on the same token, the positive stories do kind of work as well. You'll find these nunchi stories or these kind of almost self-orientalist stories that will...
The Miracle on the Han River.
That
may have
will
heard of
resonate. Yes. And I do sometimes challenge my students to find the real Korea, because it's somewhere in between, and it's not hate-filled or love-filled, but it's the reality. You didn't really describe what the book will be.
Oh, yes. It's essays. I mean, essays are what I write in the first place. But the editor said, at first he was like, let's translate the things you've written in English. And I said, well, that's fine, but I want to write new stuff as well. So it'll be a mixture. I don't want to translate my old stuff, so just maybe they can find someone. And then I'll write new essays in Korean, so a mixture of the two, like translated old stuff, and then new essays on subjects like, as I say, is Korean really a hard language? Or so many things come to mind about essays about the Korean city, not just Seoul, but the Korean city. I kind of want to write about Korean cars, too. I feel like there's a lot to say culturally about the Korean car and what it shows you about the country. I mean, I was listening recently to your episode with Mark Peterson, who we've mentioned, and you had this, maybe you will remember, maybe you won't, but he was saying how you were talking about what it's like to come back to Korea, because he's seen Korea in the depths of poverty.
Yes.
He lived here. To come back and see people driving Maseratis, or Lamborghinis, or Ferraris. And he was talking about, Mark Peterson was talking about this time he saw someone in Gangnam, I'm sure, driving a sports car that he said looked Italian. He didn't know if it was a Maserati, a Ferrari, or a Lamborghini, but it looked Italian. And we all know what that means.
Yeah.
Like a car, it looks Italian, got it. A BMW, what country does that look like it comes from? Because you're going to get it right in the first guess no matter what, even if you don't know where it comes from. What do Korean cars look Korean?
In terms of color, my immediate, rather than design, I go for color.
That's a good point. That's a very good point.
The reason I would do that, Colin, is that when I was young on long car journeys, we used to play this snooker game, or as you might say, snooker.
Indeed.
And
we wouldn't say snooker at all. We'd probably say, what, pool?
Yes.
Go on.
In snooker, there's various colored balls, and first you have to put a red one, and then a yellow one, and so on. And we used to play that with the cars on the road. So first we need to find a red car.
Right.
We've got one. Now it's a yellow car. Then back to a red, then to a brown, and then to a red, then to a green, to a blue. Pink ones were hard, obviously.
But they'd be there.
But they
sooner
would
or
be
later.
there, and you could complete
Given
the
a long
game
enough
of.
trip.
Given the game, you could complete the game of snooker on the car journey.
Right.
No chance that's happening
Oh,
in
yes,
South Korea.
no. White, black, gray, white, 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 black, white, gray, black, blue. You get blues.
It's slowly changing a little bit, isn't it?
Right.
But for the longest time, if you ask me about Korean cars, it's that uniformity of color rather than anything else.
I remember. Every car I've rented here has been white. And I remember parking one of these cars in a parking garage where every other car was white. And this was maybe 2 years ago.
Yeah.
What is that? What is that?
I'm not sure, but is it not the same with the long paddings, the coats that they will wear, where they look like gimbops, or the mask colors?
Yes.
And there is this uniformity. And I don't think it's really appropriate to start saying, oh, it's because of Confucianism and collectivism and Uri. I'm not sure it's that, but there is a lot of uniformity in aesthetic.
There is. A friend of mine has a teenage daughter, and when long padding really hit big a few years ago, of course the daughter wanted it.
Yeah.
My friend's like, you can have a long padding, just not the black one. Just don't get another. The world doesn't need one more Korean teenage girl in a black long padding. So she gets the white.
Yeah.
Now the white are big too, so
yeah,
you can choose white, one or the other, white or black.
I spent a lot of time as a young teenager in the UK trying to look different from everyone else. That was, and of course I ended up looking like everyone else.
Same in the US.
But I think here there's an element to try to look like everyone else. And
There's a way to be. Yeah.
there is a way to be here. I'm very interested in this book of essays. By the way, I do want to point out, for those that might not know you, you have this thing that you do on Twitter where you share these collection of essays that you've been reading.
Yeah, the ones I've been reading, not writing, but
not
reading.
writing, but reading, and that's
Others'
a great
essays.
source because
Glad you
it's
enjoy
very easy to get lost in just reading the same things, but you seem to have a great diversity and breadth of not only sources but also content and writers. And
Yeah, I post all the essays I read, and I limit myself to one per day because it was getting to be too much. As you know, you could on the internet you could just read essays all day, like book reviews alone. I could read book reviews until I died of liver spots, like in 50 years. You know what I mean? You could waste your life. It wouldn't be a total waste, but there are better uses of time. But one essay a day makes you think, like which essay am I going to read, and as well as you say, it makes you think of variety because if you thread them, you can see this is what I've been reading. It's for me as much as anyone else, and I see like, are there patterns? I don't want to repeat the same source, the same publication twice. I don't want to repeat the same writer, certainly, same subject, certainly. If I read something left wing, I want to read something right wing, and if I read something right wing, I want to read something left wing. Right? If I read something from an article from First Things or the New Criterion, maybe Jacobin comes next, or the New Yorker where I write. I mean, you're conscious of mixing it up and choosing wisely because you're not going to have another one today. You're going to have to work. So read one essay first thing and get it done.
And it doesn't get much traction. I see. I'm often the only one liking. So I do want to point that.
People bring it up to me, but I don't like see it. It's Twitter metrics are not that useful, and Twitter itself gets a very hard time. But there is no better right now, and for the past 10 years, there's no better way to read essays that are being published. There is nothing else. There's Twitter. That's it. There's no blog lines, no Google Reader anymore. RSS is not a technology used for reading these days. Really, other than Twitter, I don't see how I'd be keeping up with my favorite essayists and publications that publish essays without it. If it was gone. That's why I didn't quit with the whole Elon Musk thing. I mean, I didn't care in the first place, but I wasn't going to make a big show of leaving because I kind of need it. And anybody writing essays online needs it. Yeah. They're lying if they say they don't. Yeah. And they're lying if they think they haven't taken a hit with sort of people discovering them by not being on Twitter.
Oh, no, I definitely agree. And I don't think there was a mass exodus or leaving of people from Twitter. Yeah, that happened. There was this
sneakily come back on.
All these, what was it called? Mastodon or something? It sounded like some death metal thing.
That's on death's door as well.
It sounds like a death metal band. I think it is. can we get back to your Korean language acquisition?
Oh,
so,
yes.
so we've done some of your reading, but you're writing this collection of essays in Korean, which I think is a fabulous adventure to go on, and I look forward to reading it myself. But to get the Korean language, it is difficult. It's not easy, and I sometimes look so enviously at during my PhD or master at my classmates from China or Japan, and all the hanja just comes to them. The Chinese characters comes to them immediately, and they have all of these. They can get words that they might be seeing for the first time, and immediately they have a sense of it, just like we might do with French or Spanish or German or Italian. We can look at a sentence and go, well, I kind of get a sense of what's that's saying.
Strong Latinate roots, and I learned French here in Korea.
Okay.
And it is comparatively easy in a sense. And this goes into the essay I've been working on. That's why I'm digging into it now.
Yeah.
But French is also harder than Korean because
In what way?
verb conjugation.
Yeah, I can see that.
But I spoke Spanish already, so it was sort of a cheat code for me in that way. But I just wanted to learn another language here to have I guess I do. I have a lot of different sessions on the internet with language teachers for practice in Spanish, Japanese, French, and a few per week. But learning another language is a way to make the first language you're learning easier or feel easier.
Well, that makes sense,
right?
actually. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you could choose a deliberately hard one. I've been working on Finnish lately because Finnish is supposed to be, you always hear the hardest language in the world is Finnish.
Yeah.
And I can understand why. And I've been binging Finnish crime dramas to write about them. I might pitch a piece on that later. But it's just like, oh, this is nothing like Korean or English. And just having that there, I can practice Finnish once a week, Finnish Friday, I call it. It gives you a reference point. You can stay, how to put it? It puts you on the map of languages, and you can have a clearer sense of just, Korean is my main foreign language, yes. And is it even really foreign since I live in Korea? But I can realistically appreciate what is hard and easy about it. What is the Korean language like? Because I have reference points. And it's not just my native language, English, and then Korean. That binary is not quite enough for me to really understand language. And, you meet bilinguals who are fluent in both languages, but somehow unimpressive as well, because you get a sense they're just doing it. They don't really have a sense of language itself. So I try to escape that, two language binary. There's Korean and there's English. And in a way, the country itself is falling into that. There are two languages, Korean, your language, and then English, the world's language, which don't get me started on that.
Which is not. I love this idea that by learning another language on top of it, then you get a better framework, because it's so true. You only understand something once you leave it, or you put it next to something else. You have a relative frame of reference. And damn it, you're going to make me study another language now, I feel, after this conversation. Just go back into Korean for me, the Korean language specifically. So you talked about the difficulty in French, perhaps, of I can't remember now, the 13 verbs of être or something, the conjugation or something, but the gender with various nouns. If we get into the Korean language, can you give us some insight into either the language itself? What is it that appeals to you? Does it sing to you? Do you find the way that adjectives are sometimes used as verbs and vice versa, or how negatives always come at the end rather than in English? Everything seems to be, you really need to know your verbs in Korean, I've noticed, rather than nouns. There are all these different verbs.
You have to know your verbs.
We would just wear something, and they've got different verbs for hats and sunglasses and
different
watches.
Verbs with different, that's in Japanese too. Yeah, the verb matches the thing. There's always a sort of ideal verb to use, or an ideal. This is the thing about Korean that's really distinctive against any other language I've seen. You can sort of bang up two verbs next to each other in a way that to an English speaker is completely unfamiliar, and you just don't have a feel for it. Just straight up. Or, there's lots of expressions where it's just they combine two verbs together in a way that is not intuitive to us. The one that confuses every Westerner who comes here to live initially is when you go to a store, a restaurant or a cafe, a coffee shop, and you order, and they say, 드시고 가세요? Which you know the words like, the high level of eat and go, it involves go, so that must mean to go, when it's in fact the opposite. Like, you're going to eat and then go. It's for here. But if you say like, 여기 먹을게요. It sounds weird, like awkward.
Yeah,
It sounds even more foreign. I already look foreign. That sounds even more foreign than I'm expected to be. But the sort of like, eat. They emphasize eating and then going. Like the going is somehow important to emphasize that you're doing it here. But to speak to the difficulty of Korean, this actually gets to a Brian Myers point. One of the other things that stuck with me, my first interviewee here, those many years ago, he said, apropos learning Korean, I really think you have to hear every sentence spoken before you can generate a similar one. He speaks, as I say, German. German, he said, I'm quoting him, you learn the rules, spend a year, and you can speak German, credible German. Korean is not like that. There's no list of rules to learn. You have to hear everyone say everything effectively before you can, you can't come up with a new sentence, really. I mean, you can, of course, you can, technically.
I do it quite a lot.
Yeah.
My teacher will look at me and go, no, that's not how you say it. And I'll say to her, 그래도 이해했죠. But you understood it, teacher. And she'll be like, yeah, but you can't say it like that, David.
It's so Brian's points about the Korean language have stuck with me, and that's one element of the difficulty. But I asked him as well about the Korean language because I'd been studying Korean about 7 years at that point. All self-study. I really haven't taken a proper class in Korean, so don't confuse me for an academic master of the Korean language by any means. But I'd been studying Korean without ever having set foot here. And I figured, well, when I get to Korea, expats are going to be pretty solid in Korean, or going to be expected to be. So I should also have these skills. And then I got here and realized it's not the case. Expats themselves would say like, no one speaks Korean. Come on. If you can ask where the bathroom is, you're doing better than people who've lived here 10, 15 years. And that, I didn't have any culture shock in Korea. Because I've been living in Los Angeles' Koreatown. And I've been studying Korean, watching Korean movies. But that was a shock. What do you mean someone who's been here 20 years doesn't speak Korean? And they'll have this sort of survival Korean. But you wonder why. Why is that? Why do they not want to learn more Korean? And why do Koreans put up with it?
Is there an answer to that? Did you get...
From Brian was talking about how, yes, this is... The community of expats here, if we can call it that, is distinguished by its lack of mastery of the local language.
There will be some people that take umbrage with the word expats as well. They might be.
We can get to that. But, it's not my favorite word either. But it has negative connotations I do want to include here.
Yes.
And for whatever reason, Brian said, the Koreans do not expect mastery of the Korean language of the Korean language from foreigners, and foreigners, for their part. They come, this was it, this was the core. They come with no intention to stay. This conversation was years ago, so maybe a different situation now, but people do not come here, expats don't come here, especially Westerners thinking, I'm going to be here for 40 years. They say, I'm going to teach English for 1 year. 1 becomes 2, becomes 5, becomes 10. Suddenly they're married with kids, and they can't go anywhere else.
Hotel California.
Indeed. You can never leave. And they don't have any experience in any area but teaching English, which is one reason why that's a trap for many people. There's people who get out of it. I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but many English teachers complain, like, I can't do anything else. I'm stuck. I'll be doing this till I die. And that sense of being marooned, having been marooned, I felt it among expats I met. And that resentment of like, I didn't mean to stay here, but here I am. Even if they liked Korea a lot and appreciated its good qualities, they felt like they hadn't chosen it. That might be part of it. There's a resistance then to really dig into the language if you feel like I wasn't supposed to be here, But at the same time, you do wonder, why are journalists here so rarely Korean speakers, unless they are ethnically Korean? Why doesn't anybody give them a hard time about that? Why do Koreans not expect a higher level of Korean? Why does a Korean feel obligated to speak English in their own country? There was an app, Speaking Max, one of the many English learning apps that gets put out here, being promoted when I got here in 2015. And they had these commercials where you'd have a Korean girl in a library watching something on her laptop, and then a foreigner comes up and he's like, hey, do you know how to go to Gangnam Station? In English. And there'd be this cartoonish effect of sweat just explodes from their collar. And with the implication, like, not if a foreigner comes up to you yammering in a foreign language, not only are you obligated to acknowledge them? You're obligated to speak in that language in Korea.
Yeah.
Isn't something wrong there? People get sometimes pissed off when I say this, but like, isn't that bad? Like, that's bad, right?
I think so.
Yeah, but why? What is the defense? Like, let's figure why is this? Why is it good? What is the argument for this culture of fear and pressure surrounding specifically the English language? What's going on? I mean, I could theorize this is all to do with it's all down to the Sunung, right? I mean, the Sunung, it's the equivalent of the SAT in the US. The UK has something
A-levels.
similar. A-levels. And from what I've heard, the students in Korea do so similarly on it for the most part that without that English section, you don't get the variance.
Right.
You can't sort them into schools, which are arranged like this. You know, you go to the school you get into as high as possible. You don't get enough variation in scores unless you put that English section in. And so that results perhaps in this whole culture of shame around not speaking a particular foreign language, which is like, yeah, if you're going to England, I get it, but you're not even in Europe here. You know what I mean? I was interviewing a long time ago, I shouldn't say who it was, but someone very high up in the Korean cultural bureaucracy, a member of what I think of as official Korea.
Yep.
And I asked him one question. He talked for 80 minutes. You won't be surprised. I'm sure you've had experience in Korea similar to that. But in this 80-minute monologue, essentially, he got onto the subject of Sweden, as you do in Korea. And he said, the Swedes, they speak Swedish, of course, and they all speak good English. So Korea should do that. And I'm thinking, well, Sweden, population 10 million.
Yep.
It's in Europe.
Yep.
Like, why is this a relevant comparison? Why would you even bring this up? Like, what about Sweden is like Korea in any sense? Or, the founder of Oh My News, what's the guy's name?
I'm not sure. I don't think I ever knew the name.
He had this big campaign years ago. It's like, why is Korea so unhappy? I'm going to go around the world and find out which country is the happiest, and I'm going to find their secrets and bring them back to Korea so we can follow that example. It was Denmark. So he did have this whole. He built this mini industry about.
They have a special concept for that, though, don't they?
Oh, Hygge?
Yes,
yeah,
and
and that's a whole other marketing.
That was really
chart.
popular here.
Oh yeah,
yes.
Nice. You still see it, but this the founder of Oh My News pushed this idea like, here's how Koreans can be happy. Find the country that's the happiest, wherever in the world it may be, however dissimilar to Korea it may be, and do what it does. And that is like, if I dislike something about Korea in a deep way, it's that thinking like, the answer lies outside Korea. Some other country, some better country is doing something that we're not. Let's do it so we can be better. In a way, it's not a bad thing, but also.
It's dynamic.
I guess, but it's so, I mean, the assumption there is that the answer could not possibly be within. It can't. This is Koreans can't know this for themselves. We have to go outside. The whole umurek we have to go outside and find some better country. Again, I don't think the other countries are better, but this is the implication of this thinking. Like, we've got to go do what Denmark is doing, do what Germany is doing, do what the U.S. is doing. And, this goes back. I remember reading a piece by Ian Buruma from the 80s on Korea, one of my favorite writers on Asia, Ian Buruma. And he was asking, like, why is South Korea so obsessed with comparing itself to the U.S. and Japan, the most developed countries in the world? Why are those the relevant examples?
Yeah. Because
they were so developed? But there's no sense that like maybe there's an example closer at hand we can learn from, or maybe we know, there's a story Michael Breen tells in his book. I think it was the first book, The Koreans, where he came here and talked to a foreigner who studied here in Korea early on. I think it was the late Peter Bartholomew. I could be wrong, but when this other foreigner got here in the 60s or 70s, he came to study Korean philosophy, and the Koreans, his Korean classmates in the university, asked him, "Well, what are you here to study?" And he said, "I'm here to study Korean thought." And they said, "We don't have any thought." And I talked to Mike later about this. And I was like, what was up with that story? And Mike's interpretation was the Koreans in those days on that campus, they must have been thinking, if the thought we have led us to the point it led us, of what use is it? Of what good is it? Of what good could it have been if we were such a poor country for so long? But of course, that wasn't what they said. They said we don't have any thought, which is pretty telling right there. Right? I mean, you dig deep into the subjects of Korean philosophy, if I'm not mistaken. And is this still a current thing? This perception, like, oh, Korea, we don't have thought in the general public?
Yeah, I would say so. In the general public, certainly not against in the thoughts of academics or historians, because what's interesting to me is for 400 or 500 years, the big debate would be between Lee and Gi, between sort of principle and material force, between the idea of something or the actualization of something, which comes first. And these philosophers would be toying around with those ideas, but then if you ask Korean people today, it will be Han and Jong and all of these kind of 20th century manifestations. And they're said to have all of these long histories, which is not really the case. So there is a lot of Korean thought. I just don't think it's crossed over that barrier that from the Joseon dynasty to this one. If I give you this one idea, Colin, this comes from Professor Chang Kyung-sub, who wrote the book The Logic of Compressed Modernity.
Yes,
and
I've heard of it.
What he argued in that is very, very nice, man. He sent me his book, actually. He was like, David, read this. I was like, thank you very much, sir. He argued that South Korea's modernization is not only conscious, which would be unlike Sweden's modernization, which would be unlike Denmark's or something like this, or Britain's, because these countries aren't necessarily trying to modernize because they are at the forefront of modernization.
First in the pool.
First in the pool. They're not looking around going, we need to do what the other people are doing. So Korea's is conscious, unlike other countries. So that's what you're seeing. They're saying, they've got computers. We need to have computers here. They've got those that we need those. And the second thing is they'll be doing it with, I'm not sure if this is the correct terminology, but non-indigenous elements such as capitalism, democracy, liberalism, that they're using it all with these outside sources, and they're doing it intentionally. They're doing it in a very compressed manner, and that causes the ruptures that we see across society.
Yes, I believe it, and it brings to mind a Korean book I read a few years ago. I wish the title could come to mind, but the author was a professor of anthropology, I think. And he had this section, I remember, that just stuck with me so much, so vividly. He's writing to his fellow Koreans. He's saying, imagine you travel to a small African country on a vacation or just an adventure, and the plane's coming in, and you see the buildings in the African city below you are all hanok. They have hanok roofs. You land, and the taxi driver picks you up and he starts addressing you in broken Korean. And then he turns on the radio and a Jo Young-pil song comes on the radio and he's like, oh, Jo Young-pil, #1, he came here 20 years ago. He's like, isn't this weird? Wouldn't it be weird? And then obviously the implication being, well, you come to Korea, what do you see? What do you hear? What happens when a foreigner comes to Korea? It's not that, it's analogous to all that, right? But somehow the example, like, yes, a Korean would probably say that African example is weird, and yet is it less weird when you come to Korea and, you know, imagine an American coming and they see, you know, this looks a little like New York, the skyline. They come down, oh, the taxi driver's speaking to me in a kind of English. And he turns on the radio and it's what's a big song here? It's All By Myself comes out of the
That's a big song here.
Yeah, and it's like, oh, this what's the guy's name? Eric something? Eric, the singer of All By Myself.
Oh wow, I'm not sure I know, Colin.
It's Eric something. I don't know. The guy, the song is better known than the man, but you know, he came here. You know, he played a concert in. I don't know if he did, but you know, it's just like, what's going on? People would question the African example, but not the Korean example, right?
Yes.
So what's the difference?
What's the answer?
I wish I knew. And when I tell that sort of illustration, this guy uses it to start off his book, but he just wants to unsettle the assumptions of the readers. And when I tell that to Koreans, they're like, oh yeah, that would be weird. I wonder why I haven't looked at Korea in that way myself, you know? And do you have a sense of, among your students, I mean, can they think in this way? Can they see that there's something weird about that?
No, I think that it's a lovely example, by the way. And now I want to find this book and read this book. And I'm also probably going to reference this example. So thank you for sharing it with me. There's a couple of perhaps threads that I want to pick up with this. The first one would be that I sometimes just, you mentioned students. If I show my students that South Korea is, in terms of soft power in the world, number 10, they look at me and they say, that must be wrong.
Why not number 1?
Why are we not number 1?
Right.
Like, what's going on here? Switzerland, Japan, like, come on, check us out.
Yes.
And there is this, like, sense of confidence that Korea surely must be number 1. And I'm not sure whether that comes from media that they consume or things like this, because there was this over promotion of Korean things amongst domestic media. But I've always loved the idea that if Korea ever legalized marijuana, you would have all the ajoshis sitting around going, we must be the number 1 weed smoking country in the world.
Yes.
Let's go, come on.
Let's get this up, light up.
Light up. And they would
Yes.
demand to be number 1,
right.
irrespective of what it was. The second thing is, though, that there was I'm not sure if it came out of one of the government ministries, but there was this claim that the country has gone from being a country of Han to a country of Hung.
Han to Hung.
Han to Hung was the claim, and I'm wondering if there's something in that during Korea's rise, it was that some elements of imitation, but it was like, we're not where we should be, because Korean people, to a certain extent, if you talk to them, they perceive themselves, and correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm generalizing across 50 million people, but they will often perceive themselves to be above China.
Yes.
And often perceive themselves to be above Japan, right? And
in one way or another.
In one way or another, yeah, they will have that sense. And so they're getting back to where they believe they should be. I'm wondering if these imitation stories that you're recounting, they might slowly pass, because now you've got a Korea that's landed. Like, there's no denying the critical and commercial success of the movies and the dramas. There's no sort of fabrication in those. They're genuinely hit. You can see makeup vlogs and all sorts of mukbangs, the music.
Mukbang specialist.
Yeah, I wonder if it's finally here and those narratives might change and Koreans might sit back and go, well, actually, we're not going to speak English to you anymore.
Yes.
I wondered, is it
hope.
possible? Could
I
it change?
There have been moments, as I understand it, when that show Bijong Sung Hwaedam debuted. That, for a lot of people, from what I've heard, was the first time they really realized, foreigners can speak Korean at an actual level. They can actually have a conversation. So,
look good at it, doing it. Look
and that
good at
raised the bar, and that whole coming up in the world culturally as well. But then I always think, like, why did you have to be successful elsewhere to have this realization? I go back to I interviewed the frontman of a favorite '80s English band of mine, and he said to me, in those days in England, you couldn't make it in England unless you made it in the U.S. first. You had to show your fellow Englishmen, like, oh no, America accepted me. Then maybe the English would say, okay, well, we'll give it a shot, but not before. There seems to be a bit of that condition operational here as well, to an extent, like, oh, this thing was, I think Squid Game was a bit like that. This is popular abroad. Oh, we'd better watch this then.
Itaewon Class as well, I think, these elements.
Itaewon Class. I didn't watch that. I'm not a big K-drama watcher, but I did see those two, which tells you something about the success of those dramas.
That maybe that they weren't K-dramas, but they were Netflix dramas. There are arguments in academia that they're not the Korean content, but they're seen as something on Netflix, perhaps. They're seen as international.
They're seen as international, and I wonder, this with the Finnish dramas I mentioned watching as well, Netflix was a big booster of them. There's a wave of Finnish crime dramas in production because Netflix took one, Sorjonen it's called, and spread it across the world. So now there's this sense of demand. Now Finland's got to pump up their drama industry. It's a country of 5 million, so it's a little harder for them, but they're doing it. I wonder, Itaewon Class seemed Korean dramatically, especially in that it was a show about Itaewon with very few foreigners involved. Squid Game was more Netflixy, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And I haven't seen, the Woo
Extraordinary, or 이상한 변호사 Woo, the strange attorney.
I haven't watched it, but a friend of mine, an American who lives here, who has worked in Hollywood, he's saying he likes it because it adheres to Western narrative structural conventions. It plays like a Western show. Like, it hits the dramatic beats. It does things in the way, it operates in a way an American show does, or more so than, say, don't know, Secret Garden or some, Korean drama from a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And in a way, maybe I would find it more satisfying for that reason too. But it's sort of a shame as well that it's like, does everybody have to conform to Hollywood, the Hollywood deployment of plot points and reversals and false crises and false dawns and the structure that we've all seen so much of. But again, I'm no K-drama scholar. I'm sure you've had more than one on this show so far. But is it an international product or a foreign one? I mean, Japanese dramas never really took hold in the world. And you go to Japan and watch them, and you can see the production values are very low by comparison to Korea. And you can see why they don't get out. In Japanese film, they've got some high-profile directors who are big here, like Koreeda Hirokazu. But one thing I do, I used to be a frequent traveler to Japan before Corona, and I sort of like how they don't care that much. They don't care about reaching a global audience anymore. I think they did in the 80s and 90s. The bubble burst, and it was like, well, it was a good try. We're going to make stuff for ourselves now. Maybe Korea will have a similar path. Maybe not.
I think it might do. I think once that international, because today's army will be tomorrow's aunties.
Oh,
and,
indeed.
And fads and trends, they change. I think Korean culture is here to stay, but the next generation will not necessarily want to listen or watch the things that their auntie that's older than them did, and they'll want something to define their generation. It might not just be a cultural argument. It might also just be economic, and in terms of development, you might find it coming from Indonesia or Singapore, or they might be producing the cultural products at the right price that can spread around the world with just enough exoticness, but also similarity. Now,
you have to hit a balance.
You do have to hit a balance, and if we think about this balance, I wonder, Colin, is there a danger that we want things to be like Korean? We want them to be authentically Korean, not pandering to the West with these ideas or these Hollywood dramatic beats in Hanyang 변호사 의왕우. But that's a Korea that perhaps doesn't exist anymore. So I was doing a television thing earlier, and they was talking about Solal and all the ceremonies and things like this. And I said the suggestion somewhat controversially on live television that Korean culture is not a hanbok or a hanok or something, because if you look outside, you don't see those things. Korean culture is a hoodie.
Jeans and an American flag t-shirt.
Well, you see all sorts. I wouldn't just paint it like that, but you see what I mean? Yeah. It's an apartment, and it's Netflix, and it's a pair of jeans and sneakers, and it might be just as easily a German label on there as an American flag or something like this, but that is Korean culture now, and it's dynamic, and it reflects a change in ideas and values, because there's a change in resources and availability. People have different lifestyles now, and so they're carrying out. When I never really got gugak, Korean traditional music, and I wanted to try to be all sophisticated and debonair, and I'm going to get into it this year, and I never quite got it. And so I asked Jocelyn Clark, who's a fabulous practitioner and theorist of gugak, and she said, she pointed me towards some materials, but ultimately she said, if you're listening to it through a 4/4 perspective, you're never going to get it. It needs a whole different frame of mind, understanding beats, and then I finally got it when I realized it was on the 1 and the 9 beat in a bar of 12. But where I'm coming with this, Colin, is there just, as Michael Breen would argue, who you've referenced a couple of times, these are the new Koreans. Not the Koreans that we want to find or we expect, or who do seem different and confident in yourselves, but no, these are the new Koreans here. Yeah,
I always hesitate to even touch the word authenticity. I like to think I've never used it in writing once.
Oh, okay. Tell me about it. Really?
It doesn't.
What's the umbrage?
Well, it seems when someone calls one thing authentic, one thing not authentic, they're really only making a statement about themselves, right? That I can distinguish what's authentic. That's what it means, right? If this is, someone says, I bought this authentic olive dip from a village in Italy. They're saying I have the taste to discern what is authentic, and now I possess it.
No, they might be saying it is actually from that village in Italy, and it's not produced in.
Yeah, you just say
Taiwan.
it comes from there. You know, it's from this village. What work is being done by authentic, right? Or when you say, no, give me the authentic thing. Actually, it's funny. I've had acquaintances, friends, even sort of unknowns come from the U.S. And I take everybody up on their sort of, if someone comes, even if I don't know them, they'll say, can you show me around? I always do. It's always
they ask for
interesting.
the authentic experience, don't
Well,
they?
they ask for the authentic Korean barbecue. Like they'll say, I've had Korean barbecue in Koreatown in Los Angeles or wherever. Now give me the authentic thing. So I think, well, if you went to Koreatown, it's not that different from what you get in Seoul, and some Koreans say it's better in Koreatown. So I take them to, the neighborhood next to Ikseondong, with the sort of hole-in-the-wall barbecue places.
Okay.
all
Oh,
these
yes.
cookie dip-
Yeah.
They always love
yeah,
it.
yeah,
But
yeah.
because it doesn't feel like anywhere that could be allowed to exist in the U.S. The setting, the urban setting is different.
yeah.
That is, maybe they read that as authentic. But whenever I hear about...
So, sorry, authentic needs to be those little like blue plastic chairs and upturned drums.
I guess they like... I think that's what they mean. Like
Authentic means.
Is it? I don't know. I wouldn't... To myself, I never say this is authentic. I like that part of town. It's fun. It's like I never think of Han, Jong, Hung when I'm in my daily Korean life. These concepts do not figure at all in the way that I describe it to myself. Do they to you?
No.
Yeah, I mean, when would you need them?
Does authentic mean with no airs and graces or something like that? With no superficial stylization over the top? Because I'm thinking of those restaurants now, and I'm thinking, I don't know, we could go into music with a Kim Kwang-sok or something like that. There's one man, there's a guitar, there's a harmonica, and there's his voice. And you might say that is authentic music because there's no icing, there's no little cherry on it. It is...
There's no production beyond the man himself playing.
Yeah.
I used to bridle so much growing up as a music listener. Whenever anybody claimed that some music was overproduced, I was like, what do you mean overproduced? All music is produced. Where's the line? Like, where is it too much for you?
Yeah.
You're just trying to say that you are willing to sort of, how to put it? You're willing to engage with indie rock was the big thing at that time. Like, you're willing to sort of do what it takes to get into this community, this indie rock community. And that's what you mean. Like, you want to present yourself as part of something. And by complaining that some other music is overproduced, that's the function it serves. Like, there's no line. Yeah, I know what people sometimes mean by overproduction, but if it sounds good, it sounds good. If it sounds bad, it sounds bad. It's not because I did too much. It's because you're a musician. This is why I'm going this direction. It's not because of too much production. They might have made the wrong choices, but it wasn't because there's like a quantity of production that got too high, right? Correct me if you think differently.
No, there's two types of good music. There's two types of music, good music and bad music. I think there's that, but there's also this element that the authentic music needs to sound like garage rock, and it's done done. There's that aspect to it. I would say, however, there were these compression wars that started taking place in the late 90s, early 2000s, and there was this idea of overproduction that just sort of destroyed a lot of the sonic landscape of music, where there were fewer peaks and troughs, perhaps.
The dynamic range went away. But is it overproduction, or do you mean something specific? Like, wishing there was dynamic range is more valid than saying like, oh, I don't listen to that overproduced nonsense, It's like authentic is like this in a way. Like I just like there's good music and bad music, Is a culture interesting or not? I don't care if it's authentic. To go back to Ian Baruma, he has a talk about cities. So I was right on it because that's a subject of my interest as well. And he was saying, I like inauthentic cities. Places that are trying to be something else, places that are not the metropole but the periphery, that are imitative in some way. So he was making the pro-imitation argument. Japan has not been a metropole in some time. It's on the periphery and knows it, and interprets other cultures for its own use. Nothing makes its way to Japan directly. It's always put through a few different filters, and people. You could see someone dressed like a caricature of an American in Japan, but he's doing his own thing very deliberately, and it's like a work of art.
I can see that.
They're not just putting on a flag shirt because they like how the American flag looks and want some association with what they see as a rich country.
I think similar things happen in Korea, although perhaps not always aesthetically, but if you bring something like democracy or feminism or capitalism into Korea or Christianity, it goes through this Korean filter and comes out it's kind of recognizable,
Yes.
but it's done in its own different way.
Oh, yes.
You've mentioned this idea of cities, and I would say Seoul has a lot of dynamic sonic range. I mean, you can walk to these places and you can be next to Italian cars, and it's probably the same most places in the world, but plastic surgery studios with Italian cars, and then you can see people. You still see them just, what would you say, with carts of cardboard walking down the road. They still haven't disappeared.
Right,
I still, at certain junctions, see people standing in the middle of the road trying to sell like hodogwaja or chestnuts or something. There's still elements of the old and the new existing. As a man that seems perhaps rather sensitive to aesthetics, in a positive way, I say that, Colin, there might be people listening to this or watching this that have not walked around Seoul, that have not seen it, or perhaps they've done it in the past, or they've just not done it through your eyes.
Yes, most haven't.
That's we're getting there, neural links or something. Take us through a walk through Seoul if you can. Give us the country as you see it.
The country or the city of Seoul in particular?
Whatever interests you. Maybe if Seoul is, or you wanted to look at the Korean city, so it could be an abstract version.
Right. You can always tell you're in Seoul, right? I mean, even if you can't point to why you think that, even if everything around you is an imitation of something else, somehow the mixture is it screams, this is Korea. I noticed that even when I was first watching Korean movies, when I was learning the language, just starting, every shot, even if you couldn't see the Korean language, if you couldn't see Hangul, you would know somehow I know that's Korea. I've never been there, but that's what it has. The aesthetic is difficult to pin down sometimes. But even when I was first eating, like my very first exposure to Korean culture was eating at Korean restaurants in the suburbs of Seattle where I grew up. And you could just tell, even take the food aside, the look and feel of the restaurant itself, I was thinking, this is definitely not Japan, and it's definitely not China. But what is it? What am I sensing? What am I picking up on that's different? And so, in a way, I'm still doing that these 20-something years later. So when I walk through Seoul, I always wonder, just like with the Korean language, is it hard or not? Is Seoul ugly or not? People complain that it's ugly almost instinctively. Like Seoul equals ugly. Like it's axiomatic. And it was the same with Los Angeles. People would say, oh, it's so ugly. But I never saw that many vistas individually that I would call particularly ugly or particularly attractive in many cases. But
the apartments are something. Those lines of apartments.
There's something. It falls short of sublime, I will say, but they are like a geological force erupting from the city. But those apartments. Did you ever read this book, Three Tigers, One Mountain?
I did.
Yeah. So there's a passage. My favorite passage, I think, or the one I reference the most, is Michael Booth, this English writer, is driving along, looking at the apate danji along the roadside. And he's like, why do I hate these so much? What bothers me so much about them? And he thinks about it, and he comes down to, it's the numbers. It's the numbers on the side, like 201, 202, 203. And he's like, what is the number? What's the problem with the number? And you could say, well, I don't know. It reminds me of the Soviet Union or something. Everything's got a number stamped on it. But he said something insightful, which was that it's because they're so big. And because they're so big, you feel like they should be identifiable by size alone, identifiable on sight. Yet they also need a number as if they were small. So there's a sort of discomforting mismatch. There's like a conceptual mismatch, like something that big having a number.
Yeah.
And I don't hate those about the danji. I don't like them. I don't want them to go away, but they don't offend me on a deep level in the way they offend many Americans or Englishmen. There's something, I don't know. What did you feel when you first saw them? When you first saw the danji when you got here?
It's very difficult for me to comprehend because we associate perhaps in Kent, in the south of England, where I'm from, that apartments or high-rises, flats, they would be not the most luxurious of places. That they would be, for a certain class. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but if you don't have a garden or something, if you don't have a little fence, then you're not quite made it.
You haven't made it, yes.
But in Korea, that's quite the opposite.
Right. You only make it when you get there.
You only make it when you get there. And so I really struggled to see it through Korean eyes as a sign of affluence and growth and prosperity, perhaps, as they do see it. But now I'm fascinated by this idea you mentioned of that, because it is not the building itself, it's those huge, large numbers painted on the side. Yes. And I wonder if they were done in Hangul, rather than numbers, or if they had like a handa or something like this, would it seem a little bit more? Right. I don't know.
You know what gets me more than the numbers on some of these complexes? It's the names. Richenzia? Are you serious? Yes. Do Koreans fall for this? Like, oh, Richenzia. I must be rich if I live in Richenzia.
I think they do fall for it. That's what
they're not that unsophisticated. Like, they're not bumpkins. You know what I mean? Like, what is the thinking here? Is it because it's in a foreign language, kind of, that it's like, well, it doesn't really mean rich. It's just like, I hear this all the time about Konglish. When I make fun of some Konglish word that substitutes for a perfectly good Korean word. They're like, no, it's not English. It doesn't mean anything. That's just, we're just using that. Okay, but what were you going to say?
It was Hyunwoo, who you mentioned earlier from Talk to Me in Korean, that said it might sound Richenzia or Paradise Villa or something like this. It would be worse than that. But it doesn't resonate with us. Yeah. But it does to them. Yeah. So we're the wrong audience. Do you see what I mean?
This is so well matched with what's going on now, because you've seen the ads for the new Seoul City slogan in English.
It wasn't the Seoul one so much, although that is terrible, but the Busan one, which is
what are they doing?
In Korean, it's Busan이라 졌다. It's good because it's Busan. In English, Busan is good.
I've seen worse. Let's be honest. I've seen much worse. And but like the Seoul one.
What is the Seoul one now?
Well, they're picking it. You have four choices. Awesome Seoul or Seoul, make it happen. It doesn't matter. But this replaces I Soul You, the notorious I Soul You. And I came around on I Soul You. Why I bring this up is, I think there was a piece by Andy Salmon, whom we both know, when I Soul You was rolled out, which is when I moved here. And he was arguing, look, it's not for English speakers. It's for people who can't speak English. Yeah. It's English for people who can't speak English. And that is what most or all of the English in Korea is. So you show foreign friends around who visit, and they laugh at every little mistake that's made or nonsensical piece of English, but you think, it's not for us, and in some sense, it's not for anyone. It's just slapped up there to be an English or English-like word, and it's fulfilling its function. I mean, it's, in many ways, many things in Korea bring me back to this idea of language as not a vector of communication, of meaning, but of language as a tool to make something happen. Like Richenzia is like an incantation. It's not a communication. Richenzia means nothing, or all these fake words ending in ium. I mean, they've had a field day with the ium suffix, but a lot of especially English used here throws into stark contrast. Like a lot of language is used not to mean something but to do something, and it's true in our native language as well. It's true of everyday communication, but we forget this because we use words in our work. We forget that people are not using words to communicate a meaning much of the time, just to do something. They want something to happen. Yeah. So they say the words. It's almost we're all primitives in that sense. We're all people. We're all would-be wizards giving our incantations and hoping to get something in return, right?
And the words are important. I've often believed this, and my friend Chris often sends me articles when he sees this, because without the word, without the term, without identifying an aspect of society or behavior, it sort of goes unnoticed. I found that with 갑질. So 갑질 is defined sort of as the abuse of power, let's say. Someone going on a power trip. And now most Korean relationships are hierarchical, so there's always a power distance involved. But this word really came to the fore in about 2014-15 with the Korean Air and the nut throwing and everything else. And all of a sudden, everywhere across society, there was 갑질.
Yes,
people were talking about it. Yes. But of course, 갑질 existed before then.
Right.
The behavior would always be there. But then when somebody got the word to describe it, it was, there it is. Right, and it's the same with that kind of the Hon culture. It came out with the Honbap, the Honsul. Now we have the Sabasa. We just, saram by saram, we just go our own way.
That's a funny one too, because it combines the two like sa, ba, sa. Or what I like is gap, ob, gap.
Yeah.
You heard that one?
No.
Gap, ob, gap.
Gap ob gap. Tell me it.
Like the gap of the gap.
The gap ob the gap.
Like the
Okay.
highest of the high. Gap,
Okay.
ob, gap. When I saw it, it was unintelligible the first time because it mixed the two languages. And but now I hear it. Now I notice it. So I hear it
So it's
often.
gap ob gap.
Gap, gap, ob, gap.
So it's the same as sabasa because it's using a Korean word, an English word, a Korean word
This
put into
hideous mixture to my mind, but not to them, I guess.
But with those words now, it gives rise to that behavior. And without the words to communicate it, that behavior might not manifest or it might not come out.
It
perhaps.
might not. It might not. Although gapjil, with the Korean term, it's in danger of being considered a specifically Korean phenomenon when I'm not sure about that. I think gapjil is well known in the U.S.
Yeah.
And this is something, I mean, complaints about Korea, it's not just expats. We hear every day from Koreans that we know complaints about Korea, and with a remarkably similar tone sometimes. But often they seem to me based in a fantasy of what other countries are like. Like, okay, yeah, Korea has things that are bad about it, but are those things better in other countries? I mean, when someone says they feel fear on the streets of Seoul, they're not being frivolous. They do feel that. But if you ask, do you think that violent crime is not as bad in Paris or London or New York? They freak out, but I mean, unless the comparison is Tokyo, it's not better in other places. It's actually better here. And I understand that you feel fear in Seoul, but you would be right to feel more fear elsewhere, right? The comparison is sort of off sometimes. There's no cogent basis of comparison.
Agreed. No, agreed. We will come back to the aesthetics of Seoul because we got to the apartments and then we immediately went on a tangent. It's been a lovely tangent thus far. But when you said that kapjil occurs anywhere, and I would agree, and that's why I use the word going on power trip, we can think of Weinstein's or various people, stories that are there in our cultures.
Ripped from the headlines.
Yes. But there is a hierarchy in Korean relationships. I just wonder if I can get you to speak about this because it's something that I often have trouble communicating to my international students. And it's like, what you want to understand is if you're here in Korea, speaking Korean, interacting with Korean people, I don't say the names of people older than me. That would be inherently bad, and
you might not know the names of people.
Exactly, and you shut up and you kind of watch and you follow the leader and use your nunchi and all this. And I don't mean to go down that road of making everything sound magical and different, but I do believe there is something in personal dynamics where you and I, irrespective of our ages or backgrounds, can sit here on a level and speak to each other as Colin and David. That would be a little bit different if we were Korean.
It would be, although to my mind, this is the differences between not hierarchy and lack thereof, but overt and covert hierarchy.
Okay.
In the U.S., I would say is plenty hierarchical, and it's dense with codes and dense with customs and taboos, but no one's going to spell them out for you.
Could you give me? I'm from England. We have class and everything. And we have people with double-barreled surnames and accents.
England, there are things you can say, you can't say. No one's going to tell you.
Yeah.
There's behaviors you can exhibit and not. No one's going to tell you. Yeah. And in the U.S., there's this reputation of it being a country where everybody does whatever they want at all times with no repercussions. But there's a very specific line you can toe there. And if you step off it, you'll be regarded as weird or somehow suspect. Like keeping up with... I don't think I've been able to... This is something else Brian Myers said about, he wouldn't want to be an academic in the U.S. Because his impression was you can't turn around with bumping into some kind of taboo. Yeah. And at this point, he doesn't know what they are. And I wouldn't either. Like, I don't actually know when I go to the U.S., what can I say? What can't I say? In what company? I mean, it would be dangerous even to start bringing up examples here. But there are things you can't say, and you know what they are in Korea. That's the thing. You know what you can't say. You know what you can't do. And I want to know what way the wind is blowing. Yeah. In the U.S., like, I don't know how much trouble I could get in because you don't know where the guidelines are. Like, where does the track end? What am I not supposed to think or say? You're just supposed to know on some level. And it depends on, of course, the coterie you're within, but no one will spell it out.
Let me give you one story on this. There was a a visiting group of young scholars from Wellesley College, I believe it's called. It's in the United States. It's a women's only academic institution. I believe Hillary Clinton went there.
Okay.
They were visiting, and they were doing a 2-month course on Korean history and culture.
Mm-hmm.
And after the first lesson, the professor that was teaching them, they were like, we will not accept this professor. And so I got a phone call, like, we need you to start tomorrow. There's these, but that professor, they won't. And I was like, what happened? They said something that they shouldn't. Can you tell me what was said? And they were like, no.
No, we can't say it.
And so I walked into this situation going, there's all of these topics from the United States that probably I'm not allowed to say, and I'm not sure what they are. By the way, the course finished beautifully, and I love many of those students, and it went.
You didn't step on a landmine.
Well, if I did, they were forgiving of me.
Do you have a sense of what your predecessor did wrong? Like what wire?
No, no, I don't. And it was an American, by the way.
Yeah.
So it wasn't even a Korean.
You might have benefited from not being an American yourself, right? Just because there is a distance. But if you're an American, would these students were American or no?
Yeah, they were all from American.
Yeah. There's a sense like we can judge each other and harshly. We're judge, jury, executioner for each other.
Yes.
We wouldn't be with somebody even from a country as culturally close as the UK.
Maybe that's why one time when I turned up in a pair of jeans rather than a blazer and a shirt, they said, no, you should be dressed smart. They wanted that Britishness, perhaps, and that's what got me over the line. But you're absolutely correct to say that many of these conversations that are becoming difficult, and I'm trying to stay cognizant of them in the West, they're not here in Korea.
They're not here in Korea.
They're just not. And I agree with Brian Myers, because you don't have to worry about pronouns and things like that in class. And that's not to say worrying about them is good or bad, but it's
you don't have to use a pronoun at all in the Korean language if you don't want to.
I asked my Korean students one time, because I've mix of them, and I asked the Korean ones, would you like to know my pronouns and sexuality? They all looked at me like, God damn, David, no, we don't want to know that.
Close that Pandora's box.
I asked some international students, they went, yeah,
we need that.
Yeah, we want to know that.
If we didn't have it.
It's so different.
Yeah, I don't know anybody that age. As when being a professor, you stay with the young people. You stay hip with the kids, right? Whereas I know barely anybody under 35, so I'm double out of the conversation in that way, age-wise and sort of based on where I am, where I'm living, culturally being in Korea.
What I like about it is that the being around young people often breaks my stereotypes about young people. Like I said, those experiences with various young people, it's not often as bad as it seems, as it might be. You said that there are certain things in American culture that you don't transgress or things like that. I was trying to get you to speak, if you could, about hierarchical relationships. You might not perceive them as hierarchical, but the reason I want to ask you is that you speak Korean, you interact with Korean people in Korean. Right. And so you also have a Western perspective to some extent, or you have both of them. Do you have any sense of how I perceive it as a hierarchy? I perceive it as now this person is above me. There's no equality here, right? Like I have to do what this person says.
Yeah, it is. I wouldn't say that hierarchy is absent in Korea. And I don't mind it. I'm
still here.
Yeah, it's hierarchy has been. It used to be a neutral term, but it's been weaponized. Now you can say, "Oh, this." If somebody says Korea is a hierarchical society, they mean it's to borrow from George Orwell, to borrow from 1984. It's ungood. That's the valence of it.
Okay, yeah, I don't think I was actually going there, not even unconsciously. I think it was more descriptive rather than normative, if you see what I mean by that.
Yes. So how do I feel about how do I interact with the hierarchies here?
Or can you speak to it? Because it's something that I've observed, and I navigate it quite well, I must admit, and that's why I'm still here. I realize that the hierarchy, we need a new word so we don't have this negative connotations or something. This is not all Foucauldian power games, right?
Indeed.
But your place in the hierarchy is dynamic and it changes, and you might be top, you might be bottom. I'm just trying to get you with your eloquence, to try to speak to it as you see it.
Yes, as we're foreigners here, so we don't slot easily into the hierarchy, number one. And what, if anything, has sort of bothered me about it. It's being addressed too formally, like being put a bit too high. Somebody who's 20 years older than me, when they're calling me Sonsingnim, I don't feel like they need to do that.
Right.
And they're probably waiting for me to say you don't have to.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't feel like it's my place to tell them to do that either.
Yeah.
So I do struggle with that, just to letting people know, like, you don't have to be that formal. I mean, especially if they're older than I am.
Yeah.
You don't need to treat me like I'm older than you. And, it's difficult. If I think of any Korean person I talk to in Korea or otherwise, I know how I speak to them.
Mm-hmm.
What level of the language am I using?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess this is fun, it can be interesting, is when you have them together in one place.
Mm-hmm.
When you're out with somebody you speak banmal to,
Mm-hmm.
in my case, maybe my girlfriend, or then somebody you speak the highest, you say nopinmal to, or, every day nopinmal.
Yeah.
Not the emperor, but if I was speaking to her dad, for instance. And then if her sister is there, well, then I've got to aim between.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to go to banmal. She is younger than me.
Yeah.
But again, also, you don't want to be presumptuous. I don't think I've ever spoken banmal to somebody who I don't know well, who is not a young child,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which is probably kind of weird. If I was speaking to a 12-year-old
Yeah.
in 존댓말, I think they'd be a little
that
like,
would be
"What?
wrong.
This 이상한."
Yeah.
But I'm a 외국인, so people don't really care.
Mm-hmm.
As long as you're functional, they're pleased. I mean, as an American friend who visited years ago said, people, when you start talking to them, they have two emotions they express on their face. Number one is surprise. Number two is relief.
Yeah.
And so we get leeway there. And I've never made any kind of real transgression with the language and that sort of linguistic hierarchy, but it is when you're rapidly talking to different people, when you're addressing multiple people who are different levels to you, then it does get difficult, but it's not that bad. It's not intellectually hard.
No.
You have to do it in a split second.
Right.
But I don't mind it. In no sense do I mind it. I don't think, I might not be representative of Americans, but I don't think, oh man, if only I could just speak to everyone the same. If just like we'd all do banmal. I don't care. I don't think that would improve my life. And it wouldn't improve theirs either, I don't think.
No.
But I meet Americans, I meet expats of various kinds who, they rail against that. They can't even speak Korean. They rail against the hierarchy in the language.
Yes.
Or, I was talking to one a long time ago, an Englishman, not to pick on the English, but just to give vivid detail, who taught in English some other subject at the university. And he'd been deep in his cups at that point in the night. And he's saying, this is a conversation I've had a few different times with different nationality expats. They say, what if I learned to speak Korean? He couldn't, of course. If I learned to speak Korean and I take Korean nationality, when will I be Korean? And I'm thinking, you're not going to be Korean. You'll never be Korean. You can't become Korean. And for many, not just Brits, but Yanks as well, something inside them really doesn't sit well with them. I think, what do you mean I can't become Korean? They have no interest in becoming Korean. They don't want, if they could, they wouldn't.
It's just that they can't.
Why can't I be Korean?
Yeah.
And it's sort of like I'll pick on Americans. Like, this is kind of an exportation of an American idea of citizenship, that you can become a citizen of another country in every sense. We can be Korean citizens.
Yeah.
That's not closed to us. But we will never be seen as Korean. To me, that's not a problem. How do you feel about this?
It's fascinating because you have civic nationalism, you have cultural nationalism, and you have ethnic nationalism, and certain places are civic, whereas many Koreans could go to the United States, to Los Angeles, to France, to Sweden, to Finland, and go and see these new dramas, and they could become a citizen of those places, no problems asked. They do a test, and they because it's a civic type of nationalism, and the nationalism is defined by the passport, by the allegiance to the state, as it were. In Korea, it's ethnic, isn't it?
And that's
to a certain extent.
It's yes, but in the U.S., this is maybe one of these things you can't talk about, but it's also cultural. And I've said this publicly before, and I think people know that it is true on some level, so I don't mind saying it again. U.S. citizenship does not get you regarded culturally as an American, necessarily.
Okay.
In the turn of the 20th century, when there were many Italians or Irish or Germans coming, the thinking seems to have been, you become a citizen and your grandkids will be Americans. Maybe your kids. They'll be full Americans.
Yeah.
Not you. It's too late for you. You can become a citizen, but maybe your family will be American. That seems to have been forgotten about, or people decided it wasn't fast enough. Now there is the sense like, I have an American passport now. Now you have to acknowledge me as an American. They won't do it, though. That's the thing. Like people will say you're a citizen. Nobody's going to treat you as culturally an American in the same way as we would never be treated culturally as a Korean. And I don't desire to be. And when I go to the U.S., I don't feel like I am among my people either necessarily. But we pretend that, I was talking to a guy in Denmark a while ago, and he was saying, what I love about the U.S. is that it's anybody can become an American. And yes and no. As I just say, there's a way in which you can, and a way in which you can't. And it's not a bad thing not to be American, but there's the American idea of, Americans take with them the American idea of citizenship, of nationality. It's always a surprise to us to find that other countries don't have birthright citizenship, or most don't. And then, you get drunken expats here saying, why? If I were born here, why couldn't I be Korean? Well, because you're not Korean. And then you always get to like, well, then who's Korean? Is it, if I was ethnically Korean but couldn't speak Korean, as an adoptee Korean, who's just like this like salami slicing. And it's like, look, a 4-year-old child in Korea knows exactly who's Korean and who's not.
Yep.
When you get to 34, you pretend you don't know. And who is that serving, right?
Yeah, it's legally there were big changes in that. I believe it was around 1994. Whereas if you were born of a Korean woman but a foreign father, you didn't automatically get Korean citizenship.
Right,
it had
right.
to come through the father. So there's been legal changes. There's been cultural changes.
Right.
I think it's just identity has become such a big key issue these days of what is somebody and how can you be somebody. I have so many young students coming into class going, am I Korean? Like TCKs, I'm not sure if you're aware of this concept. Third culture kids.
Yeah. I've heard you talk about it on the show.
They're growing up all over the world and they're coming back and they will ask me, because a 4-year-old knows who's Korean.
Yes.
These people are Korean, right? But they don't know whether the Shilla dynasty came before or after the Joseon dynasty. And they're coming back.
A lot of Koreans who don't know that too.
That's a very trite example.
Yes.
I would imagine that most people would know, but you see what I
sure.
mean? They feel completely alienated from it. And so it's a very difficult thing. And I don't know, it feels like identity is becoming harder. But in Korea, it seems to be pretty easy still, the question of identity.
Distinctions are still pretty sharply drawn.
Still sharply drawn. I've thought about looking into Korean citizenship.
Oh yes, I think about it fairly often. Other expats make fun of me for that.
I wasn't sure that you would, what your reaction would be, or it's not necessarily so I can become Korean. I don't believe that would be the case, but I think it's more to show respect and to show some kind of, I'm not sure what it might be, civil behavior to the people that have shown me such civility. And
right. There's a quid pro quo there.
There is something going on there. And also I don't know. I'm not sure. I haven't thought these thoughts out in my mind completely yet, but there's this gnawing thing at the back.
Is there a reason not to do it in your mind?
The reason is, why do something?
I see.
Do you see what I mean by
Yes,
that?
yes.
Do I really need to do it? Or am I just doing it as if to say, haha, look at me, I've done something that you haven't done?
Well, that's the expat thing, right? The internal competition among expats. But nobody's taken it to that level yet. You hear this sort of, when expats get together, it can be fun, but there's also this undercurrent of like, as a friend put it, who's the best expat? And very few have taken it to that, like, well, I'm a citizen.
Yeah.
Because it's not a skill. You can become, there are a lot of Korean citizens who were just athletes and such who were just sort of waved in.
Brother Anthony, I'm thinking of immediately, who got his
fellow
citizenship and writes and
Shincheon
publishes.
denizen. Yes. He's a good example. And he was the era when, as I've heard, he went to the office to get his citizenship, and they said, oh, good, great, come back in 2 weeks. Why? Because the paperwork didn't exist.
Wow.
They couldn't give him a form. They didn't have one. They hadn't made it. Nobody had come into at least that area and asked, like, could I become a citizen?
Yeah.
And this was in the 80s.
I believe it was in the 80s. Yeah.
And if we did it, that wouldn't be a problem. But there's the question of what you gain. And the benefits are not that I mean, voting in the highest elections.
Mm-hmm.
I've never voted in any election, so, even in the U.S. So it would be a little bit disingenuous of me to say that I need to have the right to vote here, to be a full person. But one of the things that I wrote in this book of essays that my Korean editor liked a lot was I said, I don't need to call this country Urinara, and I think even if I don't, I can still contribute.
Mm-hmm.
But as you probably met foreigners who they hate the urinara thing.
Mm-hmm.
They hate all the uri, like uri, our, because I guess they feel like they're being actively excluded.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe I don't mind feeling excluded. It's okay not to be part of the uri. Like I don't feel like I'm somehow less of a human being for that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm less of a participant in the society.
Yeah.
But is that bad? I don't think so.
It fascinates me that you've never voted, but before I come to that. I was working on a program for the 법무부, the Ministry of Justice, and that was the change from the identity cards to stop saying alien registration card to foreign resident. And you would know, and that was because there were people that already felt very alienated in society. They were often from Southeast Asia.
Yes.
They were often from other parts of Asia, and they were just getting, because we should probably touch on this if identity does matter, but I would suggest that white privilege exists to a certain degree here. I'll get your take on this, but these people from Southeast Asia and other parts of Asia, they were expressing in these meetings for the Ministry of Justice that they get shit on a lot here,
right.
and they get treated very badly, and people might not be immediately speaking the highest honorific languages to them like they might be to you, despite being older than them.
Right.
And so they said, while this might seem a trivial change, to us it's just going to relieve our alienation by one step. And there were many people that pushed back and go, I like being alien, I like being outside. And they were generally, I think, the expats that you're talking about in your cups.
Do what thou wilt, I would say. I mean, this is not one way or the other. It's the same. There's a French philosopher, Jaurès, I think, I forget his name, but he has a quote I love, which is, we change the name when we can't change the thing. We cannot change alienness, so we change the name to something else. We know we can't change the thing.
But we're not changing the thing itself. It's just
we can't change it. We change the name because we can't change the thing.
Give me an example of one.
Well, okay. I'll try to find the least. It'll give me the least number of angry comments. In the U.S., I don't know if the U.K. is similar, but the word homeless. Homeless for someone who lives on the street, who sleeps rough. Homeless is now being challenged. It has been for years. Like, no, we have to call them the unhoused. No, we have to call them persons experiencing homelessness. No, persons experiencing unhousedness. Homeless itself was a euphemism for bums. Like people just call them bums or derelicts. And that homeless was like, no, we've got to call them homeless. We've got to be respectful. And then these always lose their power. Their euphemistic power goes away because society has contempt for the thing itself. You can't get rid of that. Like the word, you can change the word, but the contempt will never go away. And so we change the name pretending we can change the thing, but changing the name shows that we cannot change the thing. You're not going to do it with a change of terminology. It just won't happen. And there are other examples I will not name because I will get of the reaction I will get. But the U.S. has begun euphemisms, and every euphemism, they just get swapped out and swapped out and swapped out because people have trouble with the concept itself. The thing is naming. The name isn't the problem. They don't like the thing, and when you get down to what people don't like, there's really nothing you can do. Certainly nothing with words.
George Carlin did a lot on euphemisms in his stand-up and how I guess this is back to Orwell as well. I mean, Orwell had this wonderful essay, Why Are Beggars Despised, which I believe was in the latter stages of Down and Out in Paris and London. He came to it that the reason we hate beggars is because they're poor. If they were rich, we would like them. That's what it is about them. And we have these standards of fascination that purely comes down to money. Although I do like that idea in that because we feel frustrated by our inability to address certain things at a transformative level, at a fundamental level, then we just play with window dressing and names instead. And so maybe that was what that changed.
They form a committee and they work on a name, and it's just like, Yeah, we change the name when we can't change the thing.
Sorry, Ministry of Justice. It was we didn't change the thing. We just changed the name. Although some people did like it. I would suggest that I get treated kind of nicely here sometimes. I mean, I've done today. I've done 2 radio shows and 1 television show, and I would suggest that some of what I achieve is because people go, "Oh, there's a British professor. There's a white British professor." I will not say all of that is what.
You're
because,
a Yongguk Shinsa.
Yes.
Do you still hear that these days?
Yeah, in taxis.
Oh, naturally.
Sometimes if I've had a few cups or something like that, and I'm sitting in the back of a taxi late at night, I like the expression.
Too. I'm not even a Yongguk Sara.
I like the cups idea of it because they're not normally cups that I'm drinking. But the taxi driver will just kind of not turn to me, but ask me, "Are you American?"
They start that way.
They start that way, and I'm like, because they must perceive something of me. And I'm like, "No, I'm English," and they sort of change a little bit. And then depending on how I feel, then I'll sometimes tell them I'm a professor, and their whole being kind of changes at me.
I sometimes make people guess. They never get it right.
Yeah, I had an Indian friend, professor, incredibly intelligent, who just used to tell people that he worked in a factory just to see how differently they would treat him, just to play with people.
Yes. Yeah, you can have some fun with these interactions. Sometimes you can pretend to be one thing or another. But as I say, I never felt that at home in the U.S., partially because even there, people would ask what country I came from. Or what accent did I have, or what language was I speaking when it was English.
Yeah.
I don't know why, but it was the sort of thing that dogged me. And so when I came to Korea, it wasn't that different on that level. They were still, everybody was asking, what other country are you from? Because it can't be this one. I don't know what it is, but that part is similar in my US and Korea lives.
There is an element of you, and I hope you don't take this badly, Colin.
Yes, here we go.
That's a bit sort of Graham Greene or something. I'm not sure if that...
I like Graham Greene.
You like Graham Greene,
yeah.
Okay. But that Our Man in Havana, that kind of timelessness, or neither here nor there, but also everywhere at the same time.
I'll take that as a compliment.
I do get a little bit of that from you.
Americans can be one of 2 things, I find. There's the American who always has the bubble of America around him. Mm-hmm. Wherever he goes, it's America. He's playing by American rules. He's certainly dressing by American rules. And it's just like the world is America to him. I like to think I don't do that. But then there's also the Americans who become weird and placeless and just like, what's going on with you? I think I've got reactions that are more like the second group than the first. And all told, I'd rather be the second than the first. But Americans tend to break down in that way. The English seem more self-assured. Living in other places. Like, yes, they may hate where they live, but they don't pretend it's England, and they don't lose their distinctiveness either. For the most part, you could have a different view on this than I do of your countrymen.
I think many people would say that I've lost my Englishness. The amount of
you don't go home to PG tips.
I walked into the village hospital where my mum works for the NHS, and I was going to see one of her friends and pick something up. I walked in there and asked to see my mum's friend. I said, "Can I speak to Miss Julie Brodie, please?" And I'd just been back in Kent for a day or 2 at the time. The lady walked into the back and she went, "Julie, there's a Canadian out here for you." And I was just standing there. It
was a Canadian.
My wife looked at me and went, "Wow, is this how people treat you?"
Is this how people treat you? That is funny. She was very specific with that. I mean, the confidence of that. There's a Canadian there for you.
Yeah.
What do you think she honed in on?
I'm not sure, but she probably had an idea what an American was.
You weren't that.
I wasn't an American, so probably
not one of us.
Probably a Canadian.
Living abroad can change you in subtle ways that you don't pick up on, right? You've been out longer than I have.
You've got to adapt to your environment, and also the communicating and trying to get ideas across to not always native speakers and things like that. I think makes you neutralize certain elements of your speech. While we're here, and because we haven't got here, we started an aesthetic walk through Seoul, and we got to the apartment buildings with the numbers on.
What else do you like? I mean, I like to walk through Hanyang. And one reason why...
Hanyang being market, sorry.
With the covered market. People watching this know what a Hanyang is. We'll lay it out there.
Yeah.
I live in Shincheon, which has everything but a Hanyang. So one reason why I'll be glad to be moving to the south, to the southwest of the city, is there'll be Xizang around, and they're fun, they're stimulating, they have a certain rusticity, but they don't overdo it. They're not rustic because they're tourist attractions, right?
No.
Because people go to them. Yeah. Tourists love them. You take them to Guangzhou, Xizang is a tourist trap, but the people still go. It's still like a real place, and there are Xizang everywhere. People don't think to seek them out themselves. But if you take them, they're like, "Whoa, I'm in the real Korea." And whether that's true or not, who can say? But it is, at any rate, a place where Koreans actually go to shop, and you can get good things there for very cheap. Good things to eat, especially. So I like to pass through Xizang when possible. I like spaces like the Uljiro Jihabodo, you know that thing? Going between City Hall Station and Dongdaemun, I think. Just because every section is different, and you never are sure what businesses you're going to find down there. It's going to be like a tailor, and then maybe a mask shop these days, a new wave coffee shop, then a very old wave coffee shop where everybody is over the age of 70. And it's like a parallel world down there. And I walk through that every chance I get. Christopher Hawthorne, the chief design officer of Los Angeles, came to visit. I took him right there. That was the first place, the Uljiro Jihabodo.
So these are underground sort of, what would you call it, arcade perhaps? Or?
I guess so. And I'm a big fan of Osaka in Japan, and they have Xizang type things. But Fukuoka has an underground, has a Jihabodo, which is, an intriguing cultural comparison. How does Korea do the Jihabodo versus how does Japan do it?
Okay.
Toronto has one too. I often go to Toronto. And the Korean version is intriguing to me, though. I mean, I can sometimes give Korea a hard time because so many things they feel like they're not Korean. They are the Korean version of something else. But the Korean version is often pretty fun.
Yeah.
Like K-pop is the Korean version of something, but clearly they're doing a good job.
Yes.
They're tapping into something. I'm not the biggest K-pop listener now, but in high school, I did on my MP3 player, first generation MP3 player that could hold 10 songs. 2 of those were from BabyVox.
Wow.
That was like 2000, I think. So I've listened to some K-pop in my time. Before many K-pop fans were born, I was listening to K-pop.
You're
Thank
throwing
you very
down
much.
some OG status
Yes,
here. You're trying to say, no, I was here before you.
Well,
I never knew that there was such a long-standing Korean influence going back all of those years. Because and this was in, where did you say, Seattle?
Suburbs of Seattle.
Suburbs of Seattle. And that must have been incredibly hard. Although I guess around that time, you say around 2000s?
Yeah, circa Y2K.
You're getting Old Boy coming out around that time. You're getting the Korea-Japan 2002 World Cup. I think it's slowly sort of coming onto the international scene.
Yeah, it is. And I wasn't particularly aware of Korean cinema at that time. A few years later, I was. But just like I knew Korea was a thing. It was distinct, as I say, from China and Japan. Yeah. That had its own music. I was, like most in my generation, I was more into Japan at that time. Yeah. But I could sense that it was different. This wasn't just there's a book I like a lot, an obscure travelogue by one of yours, an Englishman named Clive Leatherdale, To Dream of Pigs, it's called. It's Olympics era. But he said, I came to Korea expecting a lackluster Japan. And it wasn't like that at all. He was very impressed at the sheer difference from what he'd expected. And I had a sense early, I guess, of Korea's cultural distinctiveness. I knew there were Korean Americans where I went to school, a fair few sort of half Koreans as well, and adoptees. Did they have many in the UK? It wasn't so much in that era, maybe.
I'm not sure if there were adoptees, but there were Korean people around me at university.
I see. Who were studying abroad, or who
were studying abroad, and would cook like shabu shabu and the food, and they would like eat this, and I had no idea what it was until.
Yeah, Korea was long in my mind on some level, but in high school I couldn't have told you anything about it coherent. It's a country in Asia, and I hear that it's not that good a place to live. Like, why would people be coming here if Korea was good? I had that whole idea, but it seems interesting and somewhat aggressive, and. At that time, I would have said, I'll probably never go there, much less live. But as the years passed, I sort of backed myself into it. When I started studying Hangul in a way, the switch was thrown, and I would have said, no, I'm never gonna live in Korea. I just want to learn to read this alphabet, which seems interesting, and here I am now.
You do that thing where you're traveling around and you start decoding all the signs and the menus.
Yeah. Well, that was in Koreatown in Los Angeles. I moved there because of my interest in Korea.
Oh, wow.
So it's I can practice, I can go, and early on I would for years, it was like this. I was studying Korean by myself, informally, and I could go to a Korean restaurant, all excited, like I'm going to speak Korean.
You study a lot by yourself, by the way, I think, don't you?
Yeah. It's
Where is the? How do you get the motive?
my
Because
way.
I like the habit. I like a guide or an instructor. I'm a very independent,
Yes,
free-minded
that's good.
person.
Of
But
course.
sometimes
We're all Westerners here.
yeah, but having a teacher has really helped me with my Korean.
I do a lot of
must say.
one-on-one.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
but in those days, you couldn't just go online, find a teacher, and do it on Skype.
Right.
You could do like flash games that taught you Hangul, and I didn't know any Koreans, so I could only practice at restaurants or businesses, and I'd go there and I could order in Korean just
Yeah.
fine, and the ajumma would be very amused, and then she'd reply to me, and the answer was always like, and I could not catch one word,
Yeah.
and somehow I didn't quit. I knew on some level you can get it, just keep going. I don't know where I got the faith, but eventually I did. Eventually I was understanding 1 word out of 5, and then it was 4 words out of 5. And now it's not that common that I hear a word I don't know in conversation. A book is a different story.
Yeah.
That's why reading books is kind of the bigyol. It's the secret weapon in a way. I was part of a practice group in Koreatown in Los Angeles, and one of the Wonomin leaders was saying, you're doing pretty well, but you should read books. Like you have to read books. And so I thought, fair enough. And started agonizingly reading some donghwachek. And now, reading Korean books, it's a daily thing for me. But I live in Korea, so it should be. Like
Absolutely.
I shouldn't be, I'm not saying this as like, I read Korean books, but then I meet people expats of long standing who say like, you've read a book in Korean? Well, you've never felt the obligation to read a book from the country that you live in and have lived in for decades? We both met people like this, but it's like they wouldn't consider it for whatever reason.
I'd say we've both met people like that, Colin, but I would also like to suggest that we probably haven't met many people like you. Now, I'm around academia, so it's a bit different, and I do know people.
I know nothing of academia.
It's very hostile and aggressive, and as Mark Peterson said, that's because the stakes are so low.
Yes, indeed.
I like that line from him. But I think you're a very rare example in the general population. I'm not calling you general in that sense, but people here of our perhaps similar ilk that not only read Korean but write in Korean, find a fascination for the language, have it to that extent. And that's one of the reasons why I really wanted to speak to you about this and start the conversation in that way, because we could have gone right deep into some of your more articles that have been considered controversial, or I don't think they are, but I don't find them necessary, actually, at this point. Can we talk then about Korean books?
Yes.
Or Korean reading? What have you read? Or you said you started off with manhwa책 or something? Or donghwa책?
I heard this tip long ago, is read what you're interested in. Don't read donghwa책. Like you don't care what the rabbit said to the fox, which is true, but you got to start somewhere. And actually, you say manhwa책, and that's I learned to read English, my native language, with the Sunday comics in the newspaper. I still have vivid memories of reading them with my dad.
Yeah.
But anywhere you can start, I read a lot of books about cities in any language, but just because it's where one of my interests lies. And in fact, one of my earliest books in Korean was called LA Toshi Sanchek, about Los Angeles, written by a Korean who was a frequent visitor. And she became one of my earliest interviewees when I started doing podcasts in Korean.
Oh, wow.
But I showed her this book, like her book, that I bought on a visit to Korea, took it back to Los Angeles, read it, and underlining everything I didn't know. And the book just broke apart. The spine was it's all wrecked, and almost every word is underlined. And she was so amused. She took it then and there, Instagrammed it. And she like said, "Oh, this foreigner interviewed me, and he read my book, and he looked at it. It's just she loved how degraded the book had become through sheer use." But I don't know. It was always like I couldn't bear not to be able to read a book in Korean, just because it seemed like the natural next step. I can't. The idea of living in a society and not being able to read its books is not acceptable to me on any level. And it just, again, this comes back to when you meet expats who don't do it. I'm not saying they're bad. They're not bad expats, but why don't you want to? It's like with this is another sort of hobby horse of mine, and Brian Myers, is about North Korea analysts who don't speak Korean.
Mm-hmm.
I get that you can do it,
Mm-hmm.
but why are you not interested enough in Korea as a culture? Why do you not have the interest enough to do it? Why isn't it natural to do it? Like, why would you not do it? Or here, it's, the expats who feel marooned, I guess they don't feel an obligation, or never did. But I keep coming back to this one question: is which civilization are you choosing? Right? Are you choosing to inhabit this civilization, or are you not? And in the case of many an expat, I think of them as living in the diving bell. The diving bell can stay down a long time, but they're always ready to hit that button.
Okay.
Something could pull them up.
Okay.
They're not really here, on some level. They're here, but they're a little part of them is not, at least a little part. And they feel like they can always just take off. They're not, they don't cogently inhabit, again, I'll use this word, this civilization, as a sort of reading, writing, or even as a consumer of media. Like, I'm not the biggest fan of Korean television, but if you can't understand a word of it, you don't live here. If you can't turn on the radio and know what people are talking about, you don't live here, I would say, in a significant way.
That's, it sounds aggressive, but it shouldn't. No, but it shouldn't, because I do agree with you.
Yes.
And I do like the way that you use the word civilization as well, by the way. It should be seen as empowering. And now I'm just wondering how to get, because when I translated the word 시장 into market for you, and you said, of course, I've gone to coffee shops with Korean adoptees that have come over here that don't even have that level of language. It's just because they don't live here. There are various people, and I just hope perhaps that more and more people will get into the language, just knowing that it can be brutally hard, but perhaps with reading, looking at what you know, what you're interested in is so vital. I mean, because a little bit like you, I was started off with these kind of kumon texts, these kind of like kids things, and I was like, I don't really want to learn about a snowman.
You're not 5 years old, ultimately.
Linguistically, I might have been at the time, but you need that thing, and so perhaps you finding that book about LA, a city you're very clearly
where I was
passionate
living at the
about.
time.
It just gives you those frames of reference, and you'll find a lot of people sit down and go, I'm going to start watching CNN or BBC or something like this to learn English. And I'm like,
they keep it on 24 hours a day.
No. If you like baseball, just baseball. If you like this,
right? They aim a bit too high. This is something that I often emphasize is when people ask, what's the secret to learning Korean or whatever other language I'm doing. And this is what Koreans could be asking this too. Like, what's the secret to learning a language is what they're asking. Well, I don't really know. I'm not Tyler Rash. You ask him. That's my first response. But second, in my own case,
have you met him? Was he like, or?
I don't know much about him in general. I can't speak. Bring him on.
He's always coming up like as sponsored things in my social media.
He's big in. He's doing a lot of work in ads these days.
Fair play to him.
But ironically, ads for this is a man known in Korea for one thing above all: his excellent Korean skills. Yeah. What is he selling? English learning apps. Okay, but in my case, learning languages, the key is to learn as slowly as possible, because something inside me sensed when I was learning Korean, this is nothing like English or Spanish. This is completely different. If you hit it too hard, if you take too steep an angle, you're going to burn out. Yeah. And when Koreans talk about learning English, they kind of want to learn quick. Pali pali. How do I master English at a native level as fast as possible? Yeah. If you try that, you'll fail every time. Yeah. You'll never do it. So you've got to learn. 얇고 느리게. It's just do it. Keep it. Don't do as much as you could. Right, but do it consistently. And every sort of self-help book about habits or whatever will say this. Consistency is more important than sheer volume of effort. And you can binge watch CNN all day long. You're not going to get anything out of it. You'll get something, but it won't be as much as if you just sort of kept the pace slow so you don't burn out. And because if you burn out on something, you put it aside, maybe for a day, maybe for 30 years, right?
What I noticed is that my learning took place when I wasn't looking for it. Yes. If you're looking for something, you're looking for those improvements, you're looking for that validation or that sense of achievement, it's not there, or it's very hard to find. It's when you're just repeatedly, continuously, through habit, hitting something that you'll step back and some people will start coming up to you and go, wow, you've done this. Your Korean has improved. You've done that. All of a sudden you're doing this. And
it's true. You have to see the same thing in a variety of contexts. I think, if I have to see a word in 100 different contexts before I feel like I can use it. Yeah, and Korean has so many abstract nouns that could be applied very widely, but not to every area you think. So, and again, that's one characteristic as well of the language, is just the sheer number of the abstractness of so much of it. And English is not quite like that, unless you're in academia, in which case abstraction is the way of the world, the coin of the realm.
You said this wonderful thing just while we're on language that I underlined in one of your articles, and it was about the thrill of moving from what you know in a language to what you don't know. And when I read that, I stopped. I was like, yes, because in the beginning, you're just scanning along sentences or menus and you're picking out, I know this, I know this, I know this. Yes. You might not be able to form a coherent message or put it all together, but you're just finding what you know. And after a while, you get to that stage of like, I don't know that one. What's that one? And
why don't I know it?
And there is certain thrill and an exploration. You go up to somebody and you go, I keep hearing this word, but I don't know what this word is.
Right. Yes.
That is a great change, I think, when you can get to that stage. And I recognize that. And I thought, I've never heard someone describe this experience that I'd been having. And you'd done that. It was something I was experiencing, but you'd actually put it into this sentence. I was like, oh, wow, there you go. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it was one of these realizations I try to hold on to, that it helps to really focus on, like, what don't I know? What do I least know? What's the thing I'm most ignorant of that I'm hearing now? Because it gives you a way to focus. And then you say, like, why don't I know it? Yeah. And sometimes, I'm sure you found this, I do know it. Or in Korean, many words that you've never seen are very easy to figure out. Yeah. Because they're compounds of other words. Yeah. And
eventually.
If you think about it for 5 seconds, rather than just popping up Naver English dictionary, you'll get it. And that's an instinct that it sometimes fails me, but I try to develop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I'm there with you on that. Sometimes in my lectures, I'll ask the question to the student whose name I don't know. Yes. I can know all the people. It's like that student, I don't know their name. And so I'll ask them specifically. And so I have that habit of addressing those things that I'm not always comfortable with.
That's hard. I don't know how to memorize a room full of people's names in any country.
I'm still pretty good at it. I wondered if it might sort of fail me as I got, but I just finished a 2-week intensive with 50 students from Singapore, and I had them all by the end of the first week. And even though the names are coming from different cultures, and they're not always easy.
That's Singapore for you.
But, you know, the people from Singapore, it was so fascinating to hear them that a lot of them had great sympathy for North Korea. And they looked on South Korea and it's kind of like, you're not quite doing it right, South Korea. Do you see what I mean? Right. They had a sense of superiority to South Korea, the people from Singapore. And I thought that was kind of fascinating to see. I was showing them some vlogs of North Korea with, I've forgotten her name, I think it's Songa or Sua, the young girl, who speaks like Harry Potter or Peppa Pig, and she does vlogs at the Minsu Water Park.
Oh, my. I haven't seen anything like this.
It's fascinating, but when I showed it it's fascinating because you can see how North Koreans want to put lo-fi soundtracks onto vlogs and present it to the world in a soft power way.
Right.
I want to see how they do that. All the Singapore students going, that looks exactly like Singapore. The architecture was the same. The layout was the same. And afterwards they were like, I give my lectures on Singapore, on North Korea, generally straight down the middle each time and let the students come to their own conclusions. And for the most part, there's kind of a lot of, those guys are pretty bad. They should, but I try to give it down the middle. Yeah. Most of the Singapore students were like, they picked up on the narrative that I do provide of they're fighting imperialism and that people are sleeping on North Korea and we need to respect them a little bit more.
From Singaporeans of all people. Interesting. North Korea, I was so fascinated by in college, up to that point. Like, up to college, I just was thrilled to see any picture I could of life in Pyongyang. Living here, I just don't care anymore.
It's the less boring Korea. It's the more boring Korea.
It's the more boring Korea. Yeah, this is the interesting Korea. But to bring up one more Brian Myers point, I saw him give a talk at the Royal Asiatic Society a few years ago.
I was there.
Okay, so you saw when he put up the first slide, they had the words North Korea studies, and then he crossed out North, meaning that you can't consider one without the other. They're, they haven't been separated that long, and in some ways, they haven't become that different. And I feel it is to my detriment that I don't know that much about North Korea anymore, or it's to my detriment that I don't care that much. I don't seek out North Korea material because so much of it is, in English, a lot of it is from the perspective of North Korea as an international actor or as an enemy of the United States. Yeah. That's why many analysts care about it at all. That's why to quote B.R. Myers, that it's a French foreign legion of the international commentariat. When you've got nowhere else to go, you go to North Korea, the North Korea circuit. But I feel my understanding of the South suffers, perhaps, from not knowing as much as I could about the North. But I don't know exactly how to remedy that because it's just, it seems deadly dull, the North. I don't know. I'm sure if you're a North Korean, you have. People forget. I mean, there's 30 million people there.
25.
25. They have society. They have people who. Not everybody is constantly cowering under a specific political threat. I mean, they're living lives.
They have dentists and
write
dreams
books,
and heartaches, and
they do. And they go to the Myers point that even a bus driver in Pyongyang feels like he is part of something, part of a mission. Yeah. On a South Korean bus driver's very best day, what does he feel like he's part of? I mean, it's a question worth asking, right? And in the U.S., a bus driver is probably seething with rage because they're not a celebrity. We see them that way anyway, But it's a lot of societies end up failing to give their people a reason to live. And in the U.S., the attitude's like, go find your own. Come on, you can make up your own reason to live, can't you? You can be completely atomized. Okay, go forth. I don't know if that's a healthy way of looking at things necessarily.
Just in case this ever gets to Mr. or Professor Dr. B.R. Myers, because you've mentioned his name so many times, I do need to say that whenever I've emailed him for advice and assistance, he's replied instantly.
Oh, yes.
And so graciously, with his time, so generous. And this is a person who, if you say something contrary to him online or something like this, there'll be blog posts coming out. And he can seem a quite frightening chap, I guess, not just in the way he presents himself, but in some of his
somewhat severe
rhetoric
in his public,
and his
persona.
Yeah, and his blog is fantastic.
Oh,
by
yeah,
the way.
I'm a religious reader of it, and I don't read many blogs.
No, and I don't even know what it means. I've often had a conversation with this.
The meaning of his blog?
The meaning of the name of his blog.
Oh, Steel?
Steel?
The stone tablet?
Oh, is that what it is?
Yeah.
I always looked at it as something like Shettle Press or something like that.
I don't know the exact pronunciation, but it's an old stone tablet, I thought. I don't know.
That would make much
Aren't there Buddhist texts written on them?
That would make... Now I'm seeing it. I was just probably seeing it all wrong. Now it's suddenly... when words
are odd name
put together in an address, but always so very gracious with his time. And his blogs on South Korean politics are fascinating because he says things that nobody else will say. Yeah, and you can only get it there.
He says, this is again something else I say that makes people mad, but he speaks and reads Korean. He reads North Korean publications. And if you say you expect someone to do that when they're a North Korea analyst, people will act like you're talking nonsense. But it's like with the journalists in South Korea. Like, if you were a journalist in Argentina and you couldn't speak Spanish, it's a poor show, isn't it?
Yes.
But here, it's somehow accepted. And I've heard rationalizations like, I've come to run the bureau and we have reporters and we have English-speaking sources and translators, so it's all the infrastructure is there. But why are you running the bureau if you have no interest in Korea, no experience here? Why did you want to run it? Why did they send you? And then it's in some way the dirty secret of at least English language journalism in Korea. I mean, and I don't think people know. Americans reading the newspaper that they're reading. It's like the article you're reading was written by an illiterate. This man can't read. Do you understand? Because I think they assume that somebody reporting reporting about either Korea at least is competent in the language. But people just like throw a fit when you point it out. But I think it's again, you've been privy to these expat conversations. If you strike at the heart of something, people get angry. And so you're probably hitting on something true if people get mad.
I would say that the British ambassador, Colin Crooks, he's one of the very few here that will speak Korean. I'm not sure if you've heard him speak Korean, but he speaks...
I've heard of him. I haven't heard him, but I'm glad to hear it.
Speaks Korean excellently. He made a point, because I told him about it. I said, I think it's fantastic that while you're here, you're not only doing the things that you're doing and the messages, but you're doing it in not just Korean, but very well-spoken Korean. And he said to me, I think I'm allowed to say, he said, I'm one of the very few that does it. While sort of the Chinese and the Russian, but from that community, he's one of the very few. And that's because he was in Pyongyang for 4 or 5 years, the ambassador there, and you got to speak it there, experience. I guess.
Well, it's just, I know it's common practice to send ambassadors, at least the U.S., to send ambassadors who don't speak a word of the language of the country they're going to. But why? Why don't you send someone who speaks the language? You could say, well, we don't want another Reischauer who should have been paid half by the Japanese government. Like we want somebody who's not tied to the host country. But I come back again and again to this theme. Like, is speaking a language too much to ask?
No.
For many Americans, it is too much to ask.
No, I agree. I would suggest perhaps standards are changing now. Do you? I mean, we're definitely not in the 1980s or 1990s anymore. Right. I think there's more onus now on people coming to Korea to have a better grasp of the language. I think we're getting there. It might not always be with people for the BBC or something like that, or these operations, but I think there is slowly change. And maybe if this conversation does anything, Colin, it will push people towards that.
I'll tell you a story that backs up what you're saying, that symbolizes this shift in a way, or symbolizes where we've come from and where we're going to. I was at a party years ago for TBS EFM, where you've contributed shows as well, if I'm not mistaken.
Indeed.
The English language radio station in Korea. And we were all gathered, and I was doing an urbanism segment at that time. That's why I was there. And I met a big star in the English language radio world, a Westerner. A big star in English language Korean radio is a bit of a contradiction in terms, but we were chatting, and you exchange stories about why you're here. And I said, well, I was in the U.S. and I studied Korean for 7 or so years, and then came here. And this guy stops the party, gets everybody's attention. Like, hey, this guy studied Korean before he came here. And I was thinking, does this happen in China? Do you get it? Just because I'd studied it before I came here, that was reason enough. It was like a freak show. Like, he studied Korean before he came to Korea. Like, it was unthinkable. That might not happen much longer, those type of reactions.
So, yeah. No, and even speaking to you in this sense, I'm getting I'm determined to go and read more Korean books. I've got my Korean books I need to read this year and keep up with it. But yes. I think you are the change you want to see in the world, and at least you're walking the walk while you talk it. I think that's very important, because it's easy to have things to say and opinions to get, but one needs to be informed and one needs to be educated, as well as just compassionate, as well as just opinionated. And you seem to be focused not only on what you say, but putting yourself in the best possible position to walk through the markets, to speak to the people.
It's what's interesting, right? And it's to me, I'm just doing what's interesting. And as you are as well, I assume that's where you track toward naturally.
I don't work a day in my life. I'm just playing. Well, I do work. I of course I do things, but can we, now we've laid all of that groundwork, talk about that article for Unheard, I believe it was.
Yeah, though I've only done one for them. Yeah, they. Well, it's one of the least interesting things I've written about Korea, but go on.
I know, because that might be the thing that some people immediately associate you with, and so now we've
it did do well, of what I was told.
Yeah, but it also received a lot of backlash, and I believe I sent you a message after that, and because I saw there was a lot going on.
Well, your message was one of the only responses I did see. I actually haven't seen any public responses to that article. Okay. I know it got around.
Yeah.
But whenever I see my notifications going up too fast, I just don't check them for a couple days.
Yeah, okay.
And then it's over.
Yeah.
So, yes, I've been told by you and others, a lot of people were angry about it. But I didn't see any of it. So in a way, it doesn't exist. I'll tell you this. Every direct piece of feedback, positive.
Yeah.
And there are such pieces. And that piece was a little too short. I mean, as I said, it was written to order for that site. They got in touch with me, and it wasn't a subject of great interest to me.
Wasn't something you had to get out.
No, not at all. They just said, "You want to do this?" So I did.
Yeah.
And I read Unheard. It's of the sort of conservative, contrarian sites that have popped up, it's the best, I think. And I'm not allergic to that stuff at all.
I didn't know Unheard is a conservative, contrarian site.
Oh, I think the figure who started it in the UK was a sort of a big Tory.
Okay.
And it has that tone. I'm not saying every piece is ultra right wing or something, but that's the general slant of it.
Okay.
But they publish. Michel Houellebecq. They publish. Who else has written for them? They've published Jeff Dyer. They've published Douglas Copeland. If it's good enough for these guys, it's good enough for me.
I like Michel Houellebecq.
Yes. He's been on more than once. He's been on Unheard.
Okay.
And so I was like, great, I'll write for that site. And they said, you want to write about Hallyu? Because at the VNA, there's a show on Hallyu.
Yeah.
I think it might be over now. We're still going on, maybe. But so I said, okay. And turned in a draft. And I liked the draft. And then I got the edit back. And you write for publications too.
Yeah.
So sometimes you'll get an edit back and it won't look that much like what you sent in. And I wonder, well, can I live with this or can I not? And I decided that I could because it was cut way down and missing some parts I liked.
Yes.
And it often happens, especially with sites where I don't write much, or this was the first time with Unheard. Yeah. You don't know their methods. And so, I think, well, okay. And I sort of did what I could with the edit. And then they did another edit, and it went up. So I was like, well, this is pretty good, I guess. The editor was concerned that she really wanted me to use the phrase cultural appropriation. So I worked that in.
Okay.
That was not a factor initially, but I could sense, I can sense what she wants, which is, okay, this has to be, I knew who I was writing for, audience-wise at that point. And I thought it was okay. It was not long enough to really get interesting. You get this sort of 1,500 word. You can't say anything in 1,500 words. I can't. Anyway.
What's an ideal essay? Because a lot of the ones you do post, not even just your own, but ones that you do post are much longer.
Yeah, I would say 2,000 is where I get started.
Yeah, okay.
That's minimum there.
Yeah.
I shouldn't generalize because there are people who in 500 words can write something very incisive. I can't do that.
Blaise Pascal said, "Forgive me that the letter I've written you today is so long that I did not have the time to make it shorter."
I didn't have the time to make it. I like that quote. It comes back to mind every so often. I wish I had the time to go shorter sometimes. I'd be more successful. But the piece was okay, I thought. But then it came out, as you know, we don't write the headlines. Writers don't write headlines. That might not be well known. But if you write a piece...
I do for all mine in the Korea Times.
Okay, well, other than you.
It's different. Yeah.
I have almost never written a headline for a major publication. Someone else does it. And the headline they gave it was, South Korea is stealing from the West? Something like that. And I just, I understood though. People click on that.
Yeah.
And it would not be wrong to call that a clickbait headline. I'm not averse to the occasional clickbait headline. That I do not feel that was part of my piece.
Right.
At the same time, I don't think South Korea is stealing from the West, nor did I say it in that piece. But out it comes. And I suspect, again, having not seen any of the feedback, people are mostly responding to the headline.
Yeah. On social media, never.
No. You want to read the article first? Of course I do. Twitter asked me that when I wrote the article myself, too. I retweet my own stuff, and it's like, you want to read it? It's like, you've got a long way to go, Twitter, before you really get ready for prime time. But, yeah, I guess I would guess people got mad about the headline, but it wasn't under my control. But some friends brought up objections to that piece, but I realized when they laid them out, they were responding to something I didn't say. So you can't control how you're received and what people think you're saying when it's not on the page. As you know, you're a public writer as well. Yeah. I'm sure you've had the experience when someone asks you, like, what was all this about? Why did you write? They'll give you an argument and you didn't make the argument.
Show me, I don't see it.
Yeah, I don't see it. And I don't want to blame the editorial process here too much, but editors in many publications want to they want to give you an argument. If you don't have enough of an argument, they want to make sure you do have one.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't write arguments. That's why I like writing for the New Yorker, because they don't care about you having an argument.
What do you write instead then? Is it just
I would just say essays. I start with a sentence and it goes from there. That dictates everything else. And so when an editor cuts out the beginning, it's especially disappointing because you don't see where it came from. And in the case of this piece, the unheard one, I was pleased with the opening because it was just after Chuseok and I was at my girlfriend's uncle's house with some of her relatives, everyone Korean but me there.
Yeah.
And they were watching the news announcing Lee Jong-jae being cast in the Disney Star Wars show.
Yep.
And the Koreans around me, many of them were like, I don't know, an Asian in Star Wars? It's just not going to work. They themselves didn't like the idea. So I started with that.
Yeah.
The idea of Koreans themselves kind of sneering at a foreign property like Disney appropriating an actor like Lee Jong-jae.
Yeah.
And so it went from there, but I don't have any views on cultural appropriation. I don't think it's cultural misappropriation. I actually like it. I mean, if you get down to it, I like cultural appropriation, but apparently it was not read that way.
So do Koreans generally.
Yeah. It's you can mix it. You can go too far with this. Like there are all these videos. I saw one from, was it some UK airline where a comedian was going on about all these quintessentially British things. Oh, tea? That's not British. It actually comes from India. Taking all these things. Like, I think, what? A, why do this? And B, I'm so glad Korea would never do this. You wouldn't have Korean Air making a video saying like kimchi, not Korean. No, taekwondo, not Korean, which is kind of not
have that.
But yeah, they would never do that. They would never revel in saying nothing really belongs to us. There's nothing Korean. And I wonder why the self-flagellating, not just England, but I think Norway made a similar video. Like Norwegian things, they don't exist. They all came from somewhere else. Like who is served by these? Like, I don't understand why make that argument. We all know things come from places.
Yeah.
What are we doing here? That's what I always wonder when I see this line of argument made.
From what I saw, and it's interesting to know that the argument was being put onto you, or those words there. I like this idea that you start with the first sentence. If I remember, I want to ask you about some of your favorite first sentences, either yours or otherwise. There was this one, so the cultural appropriation element of it. I mean, that's what I did notice about that piece was the most anger directed towards at you was from non-Koreans. It was everybody else, perhaps. Maybe some of these people that don't speak Korean were the ones going at it. But there was something that really interested me in that piece for Unheard, which was that you were putting your finger on the fact, and we've already covered this a little bit, but that was what I took from this piece, that the West loves horror stories about Korea. The West loves these dystopian stories. The West wants this kind of this country where things aren't going quite right. And I believe, and I might get it wrong now but it makes the West feel better about the West. At least we don't live there.
Yeah.
We might have bad stuff going on, but at least that's not us, because there's enough proximity, but also enough distance for it to make people feel better about themselves. And rather than a cultural appropriation, that was the argument that I thought was most interesting there. And it made me think, why is that? Because the Korea that I see, live, experience, and walk through is not gender conflicts erupting in my classroom and lectures. I teach gender and society. I teach feminism and things like this. And the students are pretty young and intelligent, and they get along with it. But that's not the perspective that the West wants to see, I think.
It's not. And this happened with Japan, too, is the West or the U.S. got wind that, look at Tokyo is gleaming, and it's like this futuristic metropolis, and the trains all run on time, and everything's convenient. There are vending machines outside, and no one's just smashing them. How can you have a vending machine that isn't just beaten up by vandals? We take this for granted that this is going to happen. What do you mean no one's begging you for money? You're not getting robbed? How can they have this? How can Japan have this? Well, there must be some countervailing, not just enemy, like they must be miserable.
There must be something bad.
They must be being held down and forced to make this city work. Japanese society must work so well because everybody is miserable. And yes, there are many miserable Japanese people. there are many miserable Americans too. I mean, there's a puritanical strain of thought. Like if something good exists, something bad is making that exist. It's been applied to Korea as well. Like, oh, Korea's so developed; it's becoming one of the richest countries in the world. It's look at the celebrities they produce. Look at how glamorous it seems. People must be miserable. It must be hell. It must be hell Joseon. And then that word has got some currency in English now as well. Like if it's good, it must be bad underneath. But at the same time, like in the U.S., like why are people turning in such great numbers to drugs that just put them into oblivion? Like why do people want to numb themselves and like shut out all consciousness? I think people say like in Korea, there's no drug problem to speak of because of the laws against drugs. Fair point. But I don't know if Koreans are inclined to are they going to become a nation of opiate addicts? Do they have a reason to, right? I don't think it's just because of the availability in the U.S. Like it's addressing a real, like people don't feel like they're part of anything in the U.S. And at a certain point, you just got to shut off your consciousness and you'll do it any way you can. Like, I just don't want to face it. I think that's part of it. There are other factors as well, of course, but I suspect here people still feel like, I'm part of something and there's work to be done, and I might be miserable because I'm not where I want to be. And it doesn't feel like it's my fault maybe, but I might well kill myself. Suicide is a big problem here, but in the U.S., a lot of people are in living death in a way. So you've got to compare like to like, I realize.
It's a sobering thought to consider that whether Korea or not, there would be cultures, civilizations, places in the world that don't need drugs. That would say, well, I don't mean to be that puritanical and say no drugs, because I'm not a saint or a monk by any stretch of the imagination, but whether they be cups or otherwise. But it is provocative. I've never considered the fact that South Korea might not need these various things. Of course, there is a growing, it's not a drug-free country anymore, but according to the reports, and there is a growing seeming prevalence of Daechidong pills like Adderall and Ritalin to get the kids through these Sunung tests. But I don't think it's any way comparable to what we're seeing elsewhere.
Yeah, you're amazed. At least I was amazed. Last I was in the U.S. a few months ago, the number of people you encounter in public life who are obviously on drugs, even if they're just working behind the counter, you can tell it's the big thing now is to take like a handful of Xanax, just cram it into your mouth, and you're in this state of like. You're in a state of working oblivion in a way. Like you can still function, but you're barred out, they say. And it's fascinating because I don't see that. I don't even encounter that many drunks anymore in Korea.
No, it's a meme that the people are falling asleep in the subways and things like that. But it's not a common sight as once it was. And I take it for granted, and maybe I'm getting my perspectives wrong here, but there's a growing number, especially on university campuses and around the universities, of unmanned convenience stores.
Oh my God, yeah. An American photographer visited recently, and I showed him that. He couldn't believe it. He was like, there's got to be someone in here. There's no way this store is unmanned. But this is a worldly guy, too. He wasn't a provincial American. He'd been all around. In his world travels, he comes to Korea, sees there's these muingage. It's like, this can't be. This can't be.
But it is. And I think there was one part of me that sort of started going, no, this is bad for the economy. This is just taking away people's livelihoods. And people do want to work. And when I go through the high pass or the toll gates on the expressway or the Pyeongtaek, I want to say hello or say something. I don't want everything to be, in Korea, I hate this word, untacked. Untacked.
Another one of these, the Konglish.
But there is a move towards that, and I wonder how many countries in the world where you could have this, and it's not, and why you can have it in Korea, because it's not as if they're all sort of, under the yoke of oppression or something like that. Or
they're too oppressed to steal.
It's not that, but they're just, we started off by saying we feel safe in Korea. Korea also feels safe enough to have unmanned convenience stores, and that's a beautiful thing.
People point to the CCTVs as one factor, which is not to be ruled out. But at the same time, this conversation always erupts online whenever somebody usually a Western pundit writes about Korea being a high trust society. And sometimes there are Koreans who will say, no, no one trusts each other. This is a low trust society, which is also believable.
Yeah.
But to an American, Korea works very well. Seoul works very well, is very orderly. To a Korean, it does not work that well. But if you really compare like to like, you can see things function here in a way they don't in U.S. cities. But it's not because Koreans are so good to each other. It's not because they like each other. And it's not because they have that much fellow feeling, I think. But I did talk to a Korean friend back in Los Angeles who said he was much more comfortable riding the subway in Seoul because, as he said, I know the person next to me is like me, which is not an expectation I would ever even have myself anywhere. I don't expect the person next to me to be like me for any reason. Or like when a Korean lives in Japan or spends a while there and comes back, they always say the same thing: is that they can't tell the sogmaum. Like I don't know their sogmaum, their innermost heart. Whereas to me, I don't know anyone's sogmaum. I would never expect to know.
Yeah.
But the expectation is different somehow, and it's. I wouldn't want to paint too rosy a picture of Korea, but to a first-time visitor, everything does seem. It seems more utopian than dystopian. And they've often been primed by media, not necessarily unwarrantedly, to see a dystopia.
Yeah.
I ask people who visit for the first time, because I always want to know, and this is, sometimes the first impressions are the most telling. So I love talking to people who are new visitors for the first time.
Yeah.
And I'll say, what impressions did you have of Korea coming in? Usually the answer is, I didn't have any. This in the era of Hallyu. Like, supposedly, K-drama everywhere. K-pop everywhere, K-movies everywhere, K-everything. Most Americans don't know anything about Korea. They have no impressions of Korea, no cogent impressions. So they come, but if they did have an impression, it's usually like, oh, I thought it was a hellhole. Maybe MASH was the last thing they saw. Or they knew like, oh, I know there's a lot of suicide, and people are drunk and angry, and everything's run by mega corporations, and people are filled with this Han that I've read about. And so they expect a dystopia, and the Western media is all too eager to give them that. But you don't get clicks by saying a place is good. You just don't. You don't get. I was reading an article about news in general. The form of media that is news. News is what upsets us. People complain like, I turn on the news, everything's upsetting. Well, that's because that's what you want. That's what you want. That's why you watch the news. You watch it to be upset. And if you really pay attention to your reactions, you can feel it. Like you're tuned in both literally and sort of psychologically when it's upsetting. And the people who run media operations know that.
Yes,
they
do.
They find their way to that.
Yes, they do.
Nobody wants to read about unmanned convenience stores in Korea. Because it's a novelty, but it's not a story. It's a story if a record number of students kill themselves after failing the Suneung. There's a story. If it bleeds, it leads. But something good or ambiguous, I would say muin kage are more. It's harder to say if that's good or bad. Their products are no good generally, but it's an interesting. I could write 5,000 words on those, but it wouldn't be a news story.
Right.
Wouldn't be an argument. It'd just be an essay.
Unless there was some mystical concept behind it, or there was something.
Yeah, this
to
is the
it,
Korean-only emotion that allows us to run muin kage. I'm sorry. Please understand. This is just for us.
Yeah, and then it would be there. Your perspectives remain fascinating. As we approach the end of our time in this little studio, so I need to get to some of these questions.
Please do.
Favorite first lines?
Oh, well, when you say that, I don't have like a library in my mind.
No, I know, but just what does anything come to you? It might be one that you've written or that you are writing or somebody else wrote or... Because when you said, because this is what I do, I sometimes, by the way, I write my columns in my head, or that's how I do it when I'm driving in a meditative state. I am concentrating on the road, I promise. But I will often construct them in my mind before getting there. But you said you start with a line, and that's how it comes.
You start with a line, that's how it comes. The first thing that came to mind, memorable first lines, which was an interesting exercise, actually, was Donald Ritchie's book on Ozu, on Yasujiro, Ozu Yasujiro, the filmmaker. He said, Ozu Yasujiro, the most Japanese of all Japanese filmmakers, had one great subject, the Japanese family, and one great theme, its dissolution. There's Ozu for you right there. And it's also a line that gets you in trouble now. I quoted it 10 years ago. It's like, what do you mean the most Japanese of Japanese filmmaker? What do you mean? What does that mean? What's a Japanese? I don't know. What's a Japanese person? What's a Japanese filmmaker? I have a friend here, an American guy I think he's just messing with me.
Yeah.
He might not be, but he seems very earnest when he says, there are no countries. There are no cultures. There's no America, no Korea, no England. It doesn't exist. It's all fake. He thinks there's no such thing as culture. Yet his life itself as an expat here in Korea belies that somewhat. I also like, this is apropos nothing we've talked about, but there's a I'm into weightlifting. There's a guide called Starting Strength by Mark Ripito. And his first line is, physical strength is the most important thing in life, period. Then he goes on to say, there are some who wish it would be otherwise, but it's not. A weak man is not as happy as that same man would be if he were strong. And he elaborates, but physical strength is the most important thing in life, period. And I think he believes it. Wow. And it's borne out by the content of the book. You have to, the book has to support the line, but it's got to flow from that line. Do you have a favorite opening line?
Not any that are going to match yours right now. I didn't imagine that you would be a weightlifter.
Yeah, I haven't got quite the results I've hoped for in 25 years of doing it, but it's psychologically very important to me.
Have you? No, that's important. Have you read the book Born to Run, or have you heard of it? I started running a while back. I've moved to other forms of exercise, but it's a book about so much more than running.
Yes,
it's about that psychological battle. It's about adventure. It's just a fascinating read, that one. I want to turn to these last two questions now. And one of them is this question that I really like, which would be, if you were giving advice to 18-year-old yourself, or to young people, or people trying to do something, trying to get into a university, trying to get into a major, trying to find a job, what advice do you think in 2023 people need to hear today?
So advice to someone, not to myself necessarily, but to a young person today.
To a young person today, or if you were 18 today. But I want to make it relevant to this environment that we live in.
Right. I suppose what would be a timeless piece of advice to give to someone in that situation? I think this is what I'll say. And I've said it in many different contexts to many different people. I was talking to, I don't think she'll be mad if I mention this. I was talking to my girlfriend about this once. She used to work at a Hagwon company, a big Hagwon company, one of the majors. You probably know, even if I say it's an English language Hagwon, you know what I mean. But she quit that to become a translator. A very admirable move, I would say. And has been successful in doing that. But I think there were moments where, her old boss would call her and say, like, we need you back. We're going to pay you well. We won't send you out to Vietnam again like last time to open branches. Come back, we'll pay you. And it would be much more money than she was making then or is making now as a translator, a literary translator, but of many things as well. And it's not like I felt qualified to advise her, but what I did say was, hey, you quit that job for a reason. And it was probably a good reason. If that job was so good, why'd you quit it to translate? But also, what I want to get at with the advice to young people is, what I said was this. If you go back. Don't translate. Never translate another word, essentially. If you're going to run a Hagwon, if you're going to work for this Hagwon company, do it, give it everything. If you're going to translate, give that everything. Do not pretend that you're going to do one thing and then do another. I mean, to my mind, this could just be my psychology, but the fallback does not work. I think David Mamet said something about this, like, if you have a fallback, you're going to fall back on it. You didn't want to do the first thing. You didn't want to do the real thing. If you want to become an actor and your fallback is to become an accountant, that means you want to become an accountant. Right. You do not want to become an actor. Those of us who do not have a choice number two, because it makes no sense to have a choice number two, we see the world differently. And it's like, yes, it's sometimes my mom says to me, I should become a teacher. I'm not looking for a new career, but she just often say this. For a while, it was the Foreign Service. She said I should join, but it's not a bad thing to be a teacher, as you'll agree. It's in fact an honorable thing to be if done well. Anything
very
is.
Rewarding, yeah.
I'd tell the 18-year-old this too. Everything is honorable if you do it well. Nothing is honorable if you do it poorly. or if it's your side job, or if you're not taking it seriously. But I say every time, yes, if I become a teacher, it's not my intention, but if I become a teacher, I will do that. That is what I will be. I won't just do it. I will be that.
Yeah.
But I'm not a teacher. And it would be, the world doesn't need another half-assed teacher. And it's like how to put it? To encapsulate it to an 18-year-old, don't pretend you're doing one thing when you're doing another. Pick the pursuit and do it. And in the words of Andrei Tarkovsky, a filmmaker I like very much, sacrifice yourself for cinema. Sacrifice yourself for what it is you're doing. Because if you do not sacrifice yourself for it, you're not doing it. I have a favorite aphorist of mine, Aaron Haspel, who's quite active on Twitter. He's a Twitter aphorist, which is the medium for aphorism, I think.
Yeah.
He had an aphorism recently about how true service requires a complete obliteration of your own personality and desires for those of another. And you can't buy that in America at any price because it's against the national religion. You can't buy true service there. And you have to serve, as Bob Dylan saying, you got to serve somebody, or got to serve something, shall we say? And don't say I'm going to work this office job and maybe I'll make it as a writer, because that's do the office job fully. I respect more the bureaucrat who's just dedicated to his job than the bureaucrat who writes a little on the side. I don't respect that at all. Even though there have been writers who have had day jobs, and I know.
It's very zen, isn't it? That's the impression that I get of it. That when you eat, you eat. When you sleep, when you sleep. But you engage with the act in such a way that it becomes everything. And you'll know this, but am I misunderstanding it? Isn't there a Japanese concept like when even doing work becomes art, even shaping something? Maybe I'm getting into this nunchi type thing, but there is something that even working on something, it might be somebody working bureaucracy or an office job or something, but you do it to such an extent that it becomes aesthetic, it becomes art, it becomes something that you give yourself to selflessly. And I believe, if you do that, then you're always going to have purpose and you always have some meaning. It might not be grandiose in the eyes of others, but what do other people's eyes really matter?
Well, as long as you invest yourself into it, it's there's not this is a sort of, if you put it in the Korean frame, there's a lot of people sort of running at the same targets. Yeah. And they could devote themselves to other things. It's like, I make this point, I did an essay in Korean about English a long time ago that got a lot of traction. I was saying, not everybody, if they think about it, needs to learn English. If you have another interest, you're better off pursuing that. The world doesn't need someone who was distracted from what they do, whether it be sort of cooking or building robots or whatever it may be, because they had to spend time cramming, going to English Hagwon. If they love English, but I say, if you love English, sacrifice yourself to it. I'm not anti-learning English. I'm anti kind of learning it so you can do a test, and then the rest of your life is totally unrelated to it. It's like, or if you want to learn a different language, I wish Koreans were allowed the latitude to choose another foreign language. It's like, maybe it's not English. Maybe they want to learn French. And I've taken classes here at the Alliance Française in Hanyang, and everybody's Korean but me. And they you can tell they love learning French for the most part. But maybe they didn't care that much about English, and yet they had to devote Lord knows how many hours to it growing up.
You wouldn't believe not how many, but how moving it is to hear young people in their presentations or in their work for me where they go, I really wanted to be a dancer.
I really wanted to be a dancer.
I really wanted to be a painter.
Right.
I've heard this so many times from these young people, and you can tell they're passionate and they believe it, and that's why they're doing these work on things, or they're exploring contemporary Korea through that lens of dancing or painting. It's because they were not allowed to explore something sometimes, and maybe we'll get there. I really do like that advice, though, to do something. I believe it's empowering, and I believe that can work for anybody. The final question here, before I ask it to you, this is where I now ask you to ask a question to the next guest, and you don't know who it will be. So a question about Korea, deep, shallow, otherwise.
Yes. This is a question that I I don't know if I put it to new visitors, first-time visitors to Korea.
Yes.
Like while you're exploring, keep asking yourself this question. It's sort of an elaborate question, but this is what it is.
Yeah.
Ask yourself while exploring Korea, to what extent is this an Asian country, and to what extent is it a country in Asia trying to connect itself directly to the West? And to what extent is this a 5,000-year-old society? And to what extent is this a 75-year-old society trying to connect itself directly to its distant past? That's the question.
I love that question, and I'm looking forward to hearing somebody speak about that. No, because it's perfect, and it's the kind of question I expected from you.
There's not one answer, too.
No, absolutely.
Well, I say keep it in mind to these people, these visitors, because the answer changes depending on where you are and what you're doing. Sometimes Korea feels 5,000 years old, specious though that number is. Sometimes it feels like it was invented the week before last. And sometimes it feels like you're in Asia. Sometimes you really don't know where, like you're in some non-country that was made by an AI or something, But it changes. It's always those two axes. You're always moving along them.
Yes.
At all times.
Perfect question. And now the question I have for you is from a young woman reporter from the Hanyang Ilbo. Her name is Haley Yang. She came on my podcast. We were in here on Friday. We did a big 3-hour deep dive into everything.
And I appreciate the length of your interviews as a listener.
I'm glad. I wish we had some water here. I've been getting dry mouth for a while, and as I was doing those pang songs, they put lip gloss on me. And it's a bit like that. Haley Yang's question. It's quite simple. Why aren't young people in Korea having kids?
This is a question of more than immediate relevance to me.
Are you pregnant?
No, there's no pregnancy in my life yet, but it's I've been thinking about a lot of my friends are dads here, and should I join their ranks? There are considerations. One, I think the standard answer is it's too expensive. That's the one you'll get in the newspapers, right? But at the same time, there are so many benefits that Korea is just like, Korea's starting to make it rain on parents.
Yeah.
And especially if you live I was in Chungcheongdo, and you get even more money. If you have a kid in Chungcheongdo, for each kid, even more money than that. Like you can make a decent wage just because you have the kid for the first few years of life of the kids, the first few years of the kid's life. And I was visiting some friends in Gangnam who moved here recently from the U.S., and they participate in Seochogu's toy rental program. You can rent toys and keep them for a long time.
Wow.
Just rent them. I mean, it's free.
Yeah.
And that's the tip of the iceberg. So it's not, having a kid is probably not as expensive as it's made out to be. But what I think they mean is, the hagwon.
Yes.
All the hagwon and the, if you go the international school route, I hear that's becoming very popular. So if you adhere to every trend, it is expensive. And I think it's the idea that you have to do all that extra stuff, and that you can't, again, nothing can come from the kid can't learn anything from the home or the family. We've got to send them places. We've got to send them to, I always think to myself, Korea is not a dystopia, right? Then I hear a friend will tell me I'm going to send my toddler to a company to get socialized. It's like, oh, maybe they're right. Maybe, Korea expose is right. It really is a hellhole. But this is, you don't have to do that. You don't have to do any of these things. No. And when it comes time to take the sunung, people do it. You meet people here. It's shocking at first, but you meet students who say I got accepted early. I didn't have to take it. I just bubbled in whatever, or it was fine. It's a luck test. It's just a speed test.
Well, they did it 3-4 times.
Yeah, or repeated, and then it was fine. I went to Seogang. All good. But people, if you make the biggest possible deal out of everything and try to adhere to every trend, which I guess is the assumption of these young people, will have to do all that, then it is impossible. But, or it's especially if you want, again, if you feel like you need to root the kids in another culture, if you've got to send them to the international school. And what I feel lucky about with my girlfriend and I agree on, no hagwon, no international school. And you know what I say that angers people the most in Korea when in conversation?
No.
That I don't intend to speak to my kids in English.
Wow. Yeah.
People get angry. And I explain
They
myself.
get angry about your behavior that you haven't committed yet.
Yeah, exactly.
Korean people get angry, sorry, did you say? Or
No,
they're
not
just-
necessarily Koreans, but
just in general.
when I explain myself, when I say like I would rather raise kids here who I want to minimize the foreignness because they'll have enough to begin with.
Yeah.
And at the same time, this is the question again: which civilization did you choose? I don't want to raise kids here pretending that they are in America. I want them to be here in every possible sense, and I want to be here in every sense as well. And I mean, this changes with generations. I met an expat, an American expat, 30 years older than I am, and he told me how much he paid to send his kids to Seoul Foreign School, and it was not a small number
Yeah,
even in those
yeah.
days. And he said it was worth it so they would become American. And to my mind, well, I'd pay that if I could be assured they wouldn't become American. But people get angry about like when they say like, "Oh, you don't want your kids to be bilingual." It's as if I were going to raise them locked up in a dungeon for 20 years. No, it's fine. I'm not against bilingualism.
They'd be studying Finnish with you, I'm sure.
Maybe.
at
I mean,
some
it's
stage.
like I would like, I just don't want to set up the thing where it's like there are two languages, Korean and English. And those are the ones there are.
Right.
Like maybe you want to choose. Maybe they would prefer to learn Finnish or some other language I don't know, or no other language. It's all good. I just don't want to start off this. It's a bit on the wrong foot to be like, oh, this is the world's language. You should learn it so you can be a global challenger. Just God, please let me not raise a global challenger.
That's going to be Korea's next catchphrase, isn't it? Global challenger or something like that. That's
They've
going to be
used it before.
That's why it sounds like that. I know people that have made their children go to different schools in Hagwons just so they don't have a bilingual or a bipolar, that's the wrong word, but a dual approach to life. So it's Korean and it's American or something like that, but they need to see it on spectrums with multiple languages and things like that. And I really like that sense of it. There was something, just as we closed it out, that you said that struck me, which was because I was speaking about this on Friday after the podcast with Haley, with a good friend of mine who runs the Bry Republic.
I like that place. I've eaten
Yeah,
there.
yeah, it's very good. He mentioned that having children is, we were talking about this question after Haley had asked it, and he mentioned that a lot of it is mimetic. Or you said you see people around you having children,
Yes,
and then you wonder, should I join the tribe or not? And
Yes.
I definitely felt that reality. And so
yes.
there's this kind of, I didn't just do it for those reasons. I'm comfortable in my own decisions, but I think there is, it's not a copycat effect. Maybe mimetic is the word, but you do, if you see people around you doing it, it's not so much biology, but it's like, well, I like that person, I respect that person, I like that person, and they're doing those things, so I also want to learn Finnish, have children, whatever it might be.
Yes, the standard two. The two doors you must pass through to manhood, learn Finnish and have children.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yes.